The desert was silent, eerily so. The kind of silence that settles over the land before something terrible happens. I adjusted my wide-brimmed hat, shielding my eyes from the blazing midday sun as the truck bumped along the rough terrain. It was a long haul on this stretch of the US-Mexico border, where the only thing between you and the other side was a line drawn in the sand. And I was one of the few who still stood guard. I ran a hand through my graying hair, the radio static buzzing in my ear. Nothing on the line. Out here, that was usually a good sign. That's when I saw them. Before we move on, please subscribe to the channel as it allows me to continue these stories. Thank you. 3 black SUVs, high speed, aggressive, headed straight toward me. I didn't have to look twice. I knew who they were, the Cartel. They had been making their moves in the area for weeks, smuggling drugs and human cargo across the border. But this was different. This wasn't just another routine stop or a border checkpoint raid. This was an ambush. I threw the truck into drive and pulled off to the side of the road, making sure the rearview mirror caught the gleam of my M4 carbine. The weapon was old, sure, but it had seen enough blood to feel like it was a part of my soul by now. I grabbed the radio. "This is Agent Rivera. I've got a code red. Repeat, code red. I'm going to need backup now." No response. The vehicles were closing in, fast. I didn't have the luxury of waiting for backup. Not today. The first SUV swung wide and cut across the road in front of me, blocking my escape. The second pulled alongside, trying to force me into the dirt. The third vehicle pulled up behind, effectively trapping me in. I swore under my breath. They'd done their homework. I took a deep breath. I wasn't just a border patrol agent. I had a history. Before this, before the badge and the uniform, I was Luke Rivera, a former Navy SEAL, a man trained to survive when the world was against him. And this was a fight I knew how to win. I reached down into the glove compartment and pulled out a flare gun. It wasn't a typical tool for an agent, but it was about to be the last thing these cartel men would expect. I pumped the flare into the sky, the bright red streak cutting through the silence of the desert. Then, without warning, I slammed the truck into reverse, using the terrain to spin it around and face the oncoming SUVs. The cartel had expected me to be like the others, weak, afraid, compliant. They'd thought they could just box me in and pick me off like some easy target. They didn't know who they were messing with. I barely had time to aim as the first shots rang out from the second SUV. Bullets ripped through the air, shattering my side mirror and denting the door. The truck rocked from the impact. I returned fire, my SEAL instincts kicking in as the truck's engine roared. The first cartel member I shot fell back, his body flailing out of the vehicle, his gun falling into the dirt. I didn't give them a chance to regroup. The third SUV was already speeding up, trying to cut me off again. I didn't hesitate. I threw the truck into low gear, accelerating hard, and slammed it into the side of their vehicle, sending it skidding across the road. Metal screamed as it scraped against mine, and I felt the shudder of my rig's frame taking the brunt of the impact. One down. But as the SUV spun off the road, I caught movement in my periphery, a man on the ground trying to crawl toward the wreck to get a better shot. I didn't wait. I jumped out of the truck, my M4 raised before my feet even hit the sand. The shot rang out. A clean kill. The gunfire slowed, and I crouched behind the side of the rig, listening. One of the SUVs was still operational. I could see 2 men inside, one of them trying to line up a shot on me. They were still coming, but they weren't expecting me to have the training to fight back like this. I scanned the terrain, my mind calculating. The dry desert wind whipped at my face. I could take them out from here, no problem. But if I did that, I risked leaving no witnesses, just a bunch of bodies and a mission that would be swept under the rug. I wasn't here to be a ghost. I was here to make sure they never tried this again. I dove back into the cab, revved the engine, and spun the wheel. I wasn't going to give them the luxury of a clean shot. I aimed for the side of the road, heading straight for a cliff that dropped into the canyon. The tires slid as I steered, barely avoiding the edge, and swerved back toward them. I hit the gas. The second SUV came at me, guns blazing. But they were too close. I slammed my rig into them, the impact sending their vehicle flying off the road, tumbling into the desert dirt. There were only 2 of them left, but they weren't backing off. They were here for me, and now I was ready. The 2 remaining SUVs were still closing in. They weren't backing down, not when they saw their men go down. The cartel had a reputation for ruthlessness, and I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of thinking they had the upper hand. I checked the rearview mirror. The first SUV, the one that had been tailing me from the start, was now drifting behind me. It was trying to cut me off from the side, but I had already anticipated this. I slammed my foot on the gas, sending my truck into a hard left turn. The tires screeched and the engine howled as I fought to maintain control. The gravel road beneath me rumbled, but my hands were steady. I knew what I was doing. This wasn't my first rodeo. I'd been through more intense situations than this. I had spent years working the black sites, the dark side of warfare, where the rules didn't apply, and the only thing that mattered was staying alive. The cartel might have guns, but I had years of experience in the field, years of learning how to stay calm in chaos, to think and react under pressure. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As I yanked the wheel back to the right, I caught a glimpse of the second SUV in my side mirror. It was trying to come up on the left, but there was no way it was getting close to me. I slammed on the brakes, letting the truck skid sideways in a controlled drift. And in one fluid motion, I turned the wheel hard to the left, sending my vehicle straight into the path of the second SUV. The impact was thunderous. The front end of my truck connected with their rear quarter panel, sending the SUV spinning into the ditch. I didn't stop to watch. I couldn't afford to. I was still in a fight, and there was only one way to finish it. The first SUV was gaining ground again. I could hear the engine roaring behind me, and the screech of tires on the cracked asphalt told me they were coming fast. I glanced at the dashboard. Half a tank of fuel left. If I kept this pace, I wouldn't be able to make it much longer. I needed to make a move, and fast. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a flare gun, the kind they give truckers in case of emergency. Normally, it's just a precaution for roadside accidents, but I knew exactly how I was going to use it. I took the flare gun in my hand, set the muzzle out the window, and fired it into the night sky. The flare shot up with a bright burst of red that illuminated the dark desert landscape. I could hear the sudden shift in the cartel's movements as they realized the flare wasn't an ordinary signal. The road ahead was more than just a straight shot. I'd set the perfect trap. The flare acted as a beacon, but also a distraction. The cartel was trained, but they weren't expecting a single agent to outthink them. The flare gave me the advantage to switch gears. I slammed the truck back into drive and sped down the road at an even faster clip, heading straight for a narrow canyon that I knew would be perfect for an ambush. They wouldn't follow me through there. It was too tight, too risky. I kept my eyes on the horizon as the canyon walls began to close in. The first SUV was still hot on my tail, but it was running out of space to maneuver. The narrow corridor ahead would force them to make a choice: chase me into a dead end or turn back. Either way, they'd have to deal with me first. I barely made it into the canyon before I heard the roar of the SUV behind me. It was right there, right on my rear bumper, and now it was too close to make the turn. I hit the brakes hard. The truck lurched, the back end skidding sideways, narrowly avoiding the sharp turn in the canyon. The headlights of the pursuing SUV flashed in my rearview mirror. They were coming fast, but they weren't going to stop me. I swerved again, putting the truck into a sharp drift, using the canyon's rock walls to shield my movements. The SUV, following too closely, barely missed crashing into the canyon's edge. Their speed was their downfall, and I took advantage of their lack of control. As they tried to correct their path, they slammed into one of the canyon walls with a deafening crash, sending them careening into the dirt. It wasn't a kill shot, but it was enough to put them out of the game for now. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. There were still too many unknowns. They would regroup soon enough, and they would be pissed off. I kept my foot firmly on the accelerator, the truck flying through the narrow canyon, the dust swirling behind me. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and sweat, and the sound of my engine's roar was the only thing I could focus on. As I passed through the tight turns, I thought about Elena and the others, the people I was supposed to protect. I couldn't afford to fail them. The thought of the cartel cartelizing real human lives, dragging people into the desolate desert to be used and discarded like nothing, fueled my anger. It wasn't just about stopping their operation. It was about saving these people from a nightmare they could never escape. I pushed the truck harder, knowing the canyon was a temporary reprieve. The road would open up soon, and I'd have to deal with what was coming next. The last thing I needed was for them to regroup. I pulled off the road, taking the truck deeper into the wilderness, away from the highway. The wind howled as I parked the truck in a small valley out of sight from any major roads. I couldn't risk being spotted just yet. I climbed out of the cab, pulling on my vest and checking my weapon again. My heartbeat was still racing, the adrenaline pumping through me like wildfire. They'd be coming for me, and when they did, I was going to be ready. The night had settled, but I wasn't about to rest. My eyes flicked over the darkened horizon as I leaned against the rig, listening, my senses on high alert. Every small sound, the rustle of the wind through the desert brush, the distant howl of coyotes, felt like it was a signal. The cartel wouldn't just let me slip away. They were professionals, and I had no doubt they were already regrouping, formulating a plan to hunt me down. I had no intention of waiting for them to get the drop on me. If they wanted me, they were going to have to come to me. I took a final glance over my shoulder at the battered truck before I disappeared into the shadows of the canyon. The only way to survive this was to keep moving, stay unpredictable. I needed to get one step ahead of them. I didn't know how many men they had left, but I knew they'd come for me in force, and I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of making it easy. The canyon had a few blind spots, places where I could set traps, where I could fight on my terms. I pulled out my knife and started cutting a series of branches from nearby trees, securing them to large rocks, making sure that when they came charging in, they wouldn't know which direction I was in until it was too late. It felt almost second nature, like I had never left the dark world I used to operate in. The days of being a Navy SEAL may have been behind me, but the training never faded. Not once had I ever lost that edge, that instinct, to survive, to fight back. By the time I finished setting up, the sun was starting to dip low in the sky. The desert would be cold soon, but right now, the air was thick with the weight of what was coming. I barely had a chance to rest. My fingers were still wrapped around my rifle when I heard it. A vehicle's engine in the distance, faint but unmistakable. A truck, probably one of the cartel's backup vehicles, rumbling through the desert at full speed. I sank deeper into the shadows, the darkness swallowing me whole. I let them get closer, close enough to smell the sweat on their skin. I didn't need to make the first move, not yet. I needed them to think they had the upper hand. Confidence was their weakness. As the vehicle drew near, I checked my secondary weapon, a knife I kept hidden in my boot. I wasn't planning to use it, but it never hurt to be prepared. The truck finally appeared through the dust, its headlights cutting through the blackness like a knife. I kept low, crouching just behind the rocks. One of their men, a heavyset guy with a bandana tied around his forehead, was hanging out the passenger side, scanning the terrain. It didn't matter, he wouldn't see me. I waited for the moment to strike, the seconds stretching as I controlled my breathing. Then, the vehicle hit one of the traps I'd set. A branch snapped, and before they could react, I opened fire. The first shot went straight through the driver's side window, dropping the driver before he even had time to scream. The second shot took out the passenger, who went down like a sack of potatoes. The truck swerved wildly, but the momentum from the hit sent it slamming into the canyon wall with a deafening crash. I moved quickly, sprinting toward the wreckage. 2 men were dead. There was no time to celebrate. I had to keep moving. I heard voices, more voices, coming from behind me. Another truck. I didn't have to turn to know they were coming. They'd be in on it now. They weren't about to let me walk away from this. I ducked behind a nearby rock formation, pressing myself flat against the jagged surface, barely breathing. The second truck came into view, drifting through the canyon, its headlights bouncing across the walls. I could hear the men talking, too loud, too cocky. I waited. The truck got closer. Then, a sound I hadn't anticipated. A third vehicle, a helicopter. I cursed under my breath. They were bringing in air support. The cartel had a lot more resources than I gave them credit for. They weren't just after a quick payday. They were out for my blood. The helicopter hovered above, its spotlight searching the terrain. I had minutes. If they got close enough, I'd be caught in the open. I grabbed my gear, knowing I didn't have much time. I pulled out my last bit of C4 and planted it on the side of the canyon. If I had any chance of taking out their air support and disabling their ability to track me, it was now. The helicopter's spotlight passed over my position, sweeping through the canyon, just inches from where I was crouched. My heart was pounding, but I didn't flinch. The second it passed, I yanked the detonator and set the charge off. The explosion rocked the canyon. The helicopter jerked violently, and then it went down, crashing hard, flames erupting in a fiery ball of orange and black. The noise was deafening, but I didn't stick around to see it burn. I bolted, moving like a shadow, back toward the wreckage of the trucks. By the time I reached the crash site, I knew they had to be closing in. I couldn't wait for backup. I had to handle this myself. It was me versus them, and I wasn't about to lose. I didn't hesitate. I moved fast, stripping the weapons off the bodies of the men I'd just killed. The sound of the helicopter crashing had given me a window, but now I needed to finish what I'd started. I couldn't leave anything behind. The final SUV, the one that had been trailing, was still a good distance off. They had no idea what was coming, but I was ready. I slipped behind cover, crouching low, and prepared to make my move. The wind kicked up, swirling the dust and sand into my face, but I didn't care. They were coming, and when they did, I would be ready to finish this fight, once and for all. The desert was alive with dust and heat. A heavy silence broken only by the low hum of the truck's engine and the distant thrum of tires on gravel. I was hidden, but not safe. They were coming. More cartel goons, more muscle to finish what their dead comrades had started. They had no idea who they were up against. The last truck hadn't made it far. It was still out there, close enough for me to hear the engine sputter as it circled the perimeter. I couldn't risk waiting any longer. My instinct screamed at me to strike before they figured out how to close in on me. I checked the M4, ensuring it was loaded. The wind kicked up again, swirling fine dust around my boots as I crouched low to the ground, staying close to the canyon walls for cover. From here, I could see the headlights of their vehicle cutting through the dusk. It wasn't long now. I had no more time to waste. I knew the terrain better than anyone. These cartel scum weren't trained for this environment. They weren't used to the open desert, the twisting canyons, or the way the land could play tricks on you. But me? I had spent my entire career hunting men like them, using the landscape to my advantage. I was the hunter now. The truck slowly came into view. It was a four-door Ford pickup, a bit banged up from the chase, but still running strong. Two men inside, one behind the wheel, the other already poking his head out of the passenger side with a rifle raised, scanning the area. I could feel the tension building in my chest, my fingers tightening around the M4's grip. I had one shot. They came closer, getting too comfortable, thinking they had me cornered. I didn't move an inch. My heart beat louder in my ears than the roar of their truck's engine. It didn't matter. I was already on the offensive. Just before they reached my position, I moved. I rose from behind the rock, stepping out into the open with the rifle raised, fingers sliding over the trigger. The first shot rang out before they even knew what hit them. I aimed for the driver's side window, and the glass shattered, sending the driver slumping forward, the truck veering hard to the left. The second man, who had barely managed to get his rifle up, didn't have time to fire. He was dead before his finger hit the trigger. I didn't even need to aim. The M4 was steady, my breathing controlled as I took him down with one clean shot to the chest. The truck skidded off the road, the tires bouncing and screeching as it slammed into a cluster of boulders, coming to a sudden, jolting stop. The two men were already dead. But I didn't stop moving. I didn't hesitate. I knew that more would come, and there was no time to lose. I ran toward the wreckage, checking each body for weapons, extra ammo, anything that would help. I grabbed a sawed-off shotgun from the passenger seat, stuffing it into my duffel bag along with the extra mags I found. But I didn't stick around to loot. The job wasn't finished. I moved back toward the canyon, my heart still pounding in my chest. The air was thick with tension, but I wasn't done yet. Carlos El Diablo Mendoza, the cartel boss pulling the strings, wasn't just going to let me walk away. This was far from over. As I moved deeper into the canyon, I heard it, the hum of a truck engine. Louder now. The second wave was coming, and they had more firepower this time. The truck appeared in the distance, its headlights piercing through the dark. I crouched low, hiding behind another set of rocks, waiting. The truck slowly made its way down the narrow path, headlights sweeping across the canyon walls. This was it, the perfect time to strike. I waited for the exact moment when the truck was right on top of me. Then I made my move. I sprinted from my cover, running at full speed toward the truck, using the darkness to shield my movements. I leaped onto the bed of the truck, slamming a grenade into the back. The driver didn't even have time to scream before the explosion ripped through the truck. The blast sent the vehicle flying into the air, pieces of metal and dirt scattering everywhere. I ducked, shielding myself from the debris, but I had already moved. I was on the run again, knowing full well they would send even more men. The adrenaline surged through my veins, but I didn't slow down. They were coming. There was no escaping it. Carlos Mendoza wasn't going to give up. He wasn't going to let me walk away. I wasn't done. Not yet. As I sprinted through the canyon, my mind raced. I needed to end this, once and for all. They were too close, and the risk of leaving them alive was too great. I glanced behind me. The dust cloud from the wreckage had begun to clear, but I didn't stop to look for them. I didn't need to. The sound of engines told me all I needed to know. I turned the corner just ahead, weaving between the rocks until I found what I was looking for. The perfect choke point. A narrow pass where the canyon walls grew even higher, where the terrain was perfectly suited for a last stand. I set up a few more traps along the pass, using explosive charges to block any possible escape routes. I set the C4 timers to detonate in 2 minutes, just enough time to lure them in. Then I waited. The first truck came through the pass, slow and steady. I could hear the men talking inside, the same ones who had been chasing me since the first ambush, but they were unaware of the trap. I heard the distinct sound of footsteps as they climbed out of the truck. Perfect. The second they were within range, I pressed the detonator. The explosion was deafening, and the force of it sent dust and rocks flying in all directions. Their truck tumbled in a cloud of smoke, flipping over the edge of the canyon. The men didn't have time to react. They were already dead. But I couldn't stop yet. There were more to come. I kept my position, watching as the second truck approached. The men inside weren't expecting what was coming. I lined up my shot, and with the pull of the trigger, the game was over. The dust from the explosion still hung thick in the air, stinging my eyes and coating my throat like ash. The silence that followed was deafening. The air was still, thick with the lingering scent of burning rubber and gasoline. I stood frozen for a moment, scanning the canyon, listening. The remaining cartel members hadn't expected this. The explosions had decimated their ranks, but I knew better than to think I was done. They wouldn't stop. Not until every trace of their operation was gone. I grabbed my gear, the weight of the M4 in my hands feeling natural, almost comforting. But the reality was, this wasn't just about taking out a few hitmen. This was about wiping out an entire operation, one that had been smuggling drugs, guns, and human lives across the border for years. It was about sending a message that there were still men who would fight back, no matter the odds. I moved toward the wreckage, staying low, my boots crunching on the gravel as I approached the twisted remains of the first truck. The bodies were still inside, crushed by the force of the blast. I didn't need to check to know they were dead, no survivors. But there was no time for mercy, no time to linger on the carnage. The second truck wasn't far behind, and they wouldn't wait long before regrouping. I made my way back toward the canyon pass, checking my surroundings. My eyes darted to the horizon. Nothing yet. But they would be coming. Carlos Mendoza's men weren't the type to quit after one setback. They'd regroup, they'd come for me. And when they did, I would be ready. I paused at the entrance to the narrow pass, the setting sun casting long shadows across the desert floor. The canyon was almost peaceful now, but the calm was deceptive. It was just a lull before the storm. I had to move fast. The traps I had set in place would only hold for so long. I crouched low, listening. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of engines. More of them were coming. They wouldn't make the same mistake again. They would be more careful this time, and they would be bringing more firepower. The cartel had enough muscle to wipe out a small army. But I had something better. I wasn't just a border patrol agent. I was a Navy SEAL, trained to survive the worst and take down anything that got in my way. The sound of the engines grew louder, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against me. I dropped to one knee, checking my gear once more. The radio was dead, and there was no way to call for backup. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a phone call. It was just me, the desert, and a pack of angry cartel gunmen. I waited. The first truck came into view, its headlights cutting through the darkening sky. I pulled back, out of sight, watching as it got closer. Slow, cautious. They knew something wasn't right. They were already on high alert, which meant they weren't expecting me to be sitting here, waiting. I took a deep breath and moved into position. The truck stopped just short of the pass, the engine idling as the men inside scanned the area. I didn't wait. I burst from my cover, running full speed toward the truck. The driver had barely enough time to react before I was on him. I was too fast, too low. I reached the vehicle in seconds, jumping onto the hood and ripping open the door. The driver barely had time to draw his gun before I slammed my elbow into his face, sending him crashing back into the seat. The man in the passenger seat fumbled for his weapon, but it was already too late. My boot was on his chest, knocking the gun out of his hand before he could even fire. In the blink of an eye, both men were disarmed and incapacitated. But I wasn't done yet. The other truck was coming, and they were just as well armed as the first group. I needed to keep the momentum. I pulled the driver out of the truck, tossing him aside like a rag doll before grabbing the keys from the ignition. I had to move fast. I couldn't let them corner me. The second truck was right behind, and they wouldn't make the same mistake as the first group. I jumped into the driver's seat of the abandoned truck, firing it up and speeding toward the canyon. I needed to create some distance. I needed to lead them into the final trap. As I neared the end of the narrow pass, I slammed the truck into gear, throwing it into a sharp right turn. The tires screamed as the truck skidded sideways. I could hear the engines of the cartel's vehicles roaring behind me. They were gaining ground fast, but I knew the terrain. I knew the exact moment to make my move. The road ahead was about to open up, widening into a flat, open area, the perfect spot for me to execute the final plan. I had just enough time. I hit the brakes hard, bringing the truck to a sudden stop. The sound of tires screeching filled the air as I flipped the truck around, facing the incoming vehicles head-on. And then I saw it. The first truck in the rear view, coming at full speed. I didn't wait. I floored it, heading straight for the truck in front of me. I knew they wouldn't have time to react. The sound of the collision was deafening as the two trucks collided head-on, sending both vehicles careening off the road. Explosions followed as the force of the crash ignited the gas tanks, sending flames licking into the night sky. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The final SUV had already started to slow, and I needed to finish it. I grabbed the M4 again, slamming the rifle into position as I aimed for the windshield. The shot rang out, the glass shattering as the cartel leader behind the wheel jerked forward. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't going anywhere. I climbed out of the truck, moving toward the wreckage, ready to finish what I started. The cartel had made one last mistake. They had underestimated me. They had thought that they could simply walk over me, like they had done to so many others. But this was a new day. This was my fight, and I was going to win it. The flames from the wreckage flickered in the distance, the remnants of the cartel's vehicles smoldering in the desert night. The night air felt cold on my skin, but the heat from the burning wreck still clung to the earth, the dust swirling around me as I walked toward the last surviving member of the cartel. He was slumped against the side of the truck, groaning, blood trickling down his face from the shattered windshield. His hands were raised weakly, the pistol he had been holding now lying useless in the dirt at his feet. He didn't look at me. He was too disoriented, too beaten. I didn't give him the satisfaction of making him beg for his life. I knew better than to show mercy to men like him. I stopped a few feet away, letting the silence settle between us. The ground beneath me was cracked, dry, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. The weight of what I'd just done, the battle I'd fought, pressed heavily on my chest. But I wasn't finished yet. Not until the last of Mendoza's men were dealt with. The cartel wasn't just a collection of gunmen, they were an organized network, and I knew from the moment they attacked me that I'd be tangled in something much bigger than I originally thought. This wasn't just about surviving the night anymore. This was about shutting them down for good. The cartel leader, still breathing but barely, started to speak. His voice was weak, the words coming out in labored gasps. You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, his words barely forming. "Mendoza, he'll come for you. He's got more than just a few men." I kneeled down in front of him, my eyes narrowing. "And I'm going to make sure he never gets the chance to come for anyone again." He laughed through his bloodied mouth, a sound that only sounded like defiance, but in reality, it was the hollow laugh of a man who knew he was done. Mendoza wasn't going to show up for him. Not anymore. I could feel the weight of the gun at my side, the M4 resting in my hand. The tools of survival I'd relied on my entire life were at my disposal. But now wasn't the time for another shot. His smile faltered and I could see the fear beginning to take hold of him. He knew what was coming. The games were over. "You think you're a hero?" he mumbled, his voice full of contempt. "You're just another soldier. Nothing special." I leaned in, pressing the barrel of my M4 to his chest, just enough for him to feel the cold metal against his skin. "You'll never understand," I muttered. "But that's the difference between you and me. I'm not just some soldier. I'm the man who ends your reign of terror." With that, I pulled the trigger. He never had the chance to respond. The sound of the shot was drowned by the roar of the wind that picked up, blowing the sand across the desert floor. I didn't watch him fall. I didn't need to. It was done. I turned my back on the wreckage, on the mess I'd just cleaned up, and I started walking toward the canyon's exit. The sun was beginning to rise over the horizon, casting an eerie red glow across the desert, a sign that the night was over, and the war was still far from won. As I walked, my mind raced. This wasn't just about getting out alive anymore. The battle was bigger than any one man. It was about keeping the cartel from spreading further, from using this country like a playground for their evil. It was about making sure they never set foot here again. I had to make my way back. I had to get the survivors to safety. I had to make sure this didn't go unpunished. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it never was. The cartel was just a part of a bigger operation, and I had made it my personal mission to bring every single one of them to their knees. By the time I reached the truck, Elena and the others were waiting, huddled together in the back, looking at me with a mixture of fear and relief. They had no idea what had happened in the canyon. They hadn't seen the battle, hadn't heard the gunfire. To them, I was just the man who had promised to get them out of this hell, and I had kept that promise. I climbed into the cab, and the survivors didn't say a word. They just stared at me, probably unsure whether I was a hero or just another man who had survived by luck. I didn't need their gratitude, though. I wasn't looking for validation. I had my own reasons for doing what I did. I started the truck, the engine roaring to life beneath me. It was time to leave this place behind, but I knew the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The cartel might have lost tonight, but the war was far from finished. There were more of them, more of the men who thought they could control this land. But I wasn't going to let them. I drove, the highway ahead stretching out before me, empty. The world still unaware of the violence that had just unfolded in the desert. The survivors in the back remained silent, each one processing what had happened in their own way. They had seen things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But they were alive. I glanced back at Elena, who was staring at me, her expression unreadable. I didn't know what she saw when she looked at me, but I didn't need to ask. I had already made my choice. I didn't stop driving. I wouldn't stop until every last cartel member had been taken down, and the danger they posed was erased from the map. We were far from safe, but we were alive, and right now, that was enough. The desert stretched on, an endless sea of dry earth and jagged rock. The truck hummed steadily beneath me, the sound of its tires on the cracked asphalt a familiar rhythm. The survivors in the back seat were quiet now, some still processing the chaos, others too exhausted to say anything. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Elena's eyes in the reflection. Her gaze was distant, haunted, like she was seeing something beyond the truck, beyond the desert, beyond the world. I didn't blame her. We were all survivors now, but that didn't mean we were whole. The truck's headlights cut through the dark as the road wound ahead. It was almost surreal, how empty the world felt out here. There was no sign of life for miles in any direction. It was as if the desert had swallowed everything, the people, the noise, the violence. But I knew better. This place wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts. Ghosts of the men I had killed, ghosts of the families trapped in the cartel's grip, and, most painfully, ghosts of the ones I couldn't save. I had just killed Carlos Mendoza's men, the cartel's foot soldiers. But there was always more. There was always someone else in charge, someone higher up who'd send more men to finish what I had started. My mind kept returning to that thought as I drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. The whole reason I had taken this job was because I knew the stakes were high. I wasn't just doing my duty to protect the border. I was fighting for something bigger, fighting for the innocent lives caught in the cartel's web. I was fighting for justice. But tonight's victory wasn't enough. It couldn't be. I pulled off the highway just as the truck started to sputter. The gas gauge was dangerously low. I hadn't stopped to refuel since the ambush at the border, and I couldn't afford to run out of gas now. The next town was only a few miles ahead, but it was just another small border town, barely enough to call a place. The last thing I needed was to be seen here. I needed to be invisible, to slip away into the shadows until I could figure out what to do next. I parked the truck behind an old abandoned gas station, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might be watching. I knew that once Mendoza's cartel realized their people had been wiped out, they would stop at nothing to hunt me down. This was bigger than a single battle. It was about tearing down the entire operation, from the top to the bottom. I wasn't just an agent anymore, I was a vigilante, and I had a lot of work ahead of me. Elena didn't say anything as I killed the engine. I could see the weight of the night's events in her eyes. She had witnessed firsthand the kind of violence Mendoza's men were capable of. I had done what had to be done, but I knew what it cost. I turned to her, my voice low but steady. "We're going to need supplies. I'm going to get us some fuel. I'll be quick." She nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. We all knew what was at stake now. We were out of time. As I stepped out of the truck, I adjusted the strap of my rifle and slid it over my shoulder. The cool night air hit my face, and I breathed in deeply, trying to steady myself. I was still running on adrenaline, the intensity of the firefight lingering in my veins. But I knew that if I stayed in one place for too long, I would risk getting caught. And that was something I couldn't afford. The small gas station was dark, its windows boarded up. The station had been abandoned for years, but I knew the old gas pumps still worked. There was enough fuel here to get me out of this stretch of desert. I moved quickly, filling up the tank, but the stillness of the night made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the old wooden sign above the gas station felt like the prelude to something dangerous. The cartel wouldn't leave me alone. They never did. I finished refueling, wiped my hands on my jeans, and was about to head back to the truck when I heard the faintest sound, the hum of an engine in the distance. My heart skipped a beat. They were here, more of them. I ducked behind the gas station, flattening myself against the wall, trying to keep my breathing shallow. The engine grew louder, closer. There was no mistaking it now. I could hear the rumble of at least 2 trucks, the sound of their tires crunching on the dirt road. I had no time to think, no time to plan. They were coming for me, and they were coming fast. I bolted back toward the truck, my fingers already fumbling for the keys. The adrenaline hit hard. I didn't have time to waste. I had to move now. But as I approached the driver's side, I heard footsteps behind me. A man's voice, low and gravelly, called out from the shadows. "You're not getting away that easily, gringo." I spun around, my hand reaching for my gun. 2 men, both cartel members, stepped into the moonlight. They had been lying in wait, silently approaching from behind. They had a truck parked just beyond the gas station, the engine still running. The trap had been set. I didn't waste time talking. They were too close now. One of them raised a shotgun, aiming straight at me. I dove to the side, rolling behind the rig. I had seconds to act before they opened fire. I heard them shout, their footsteps pounding as they moved around the truck, flanking me. I couldn't see them, but I could hear their movements. I had the advantage. With a surge of energy, I leapt to my feet, firing a shot that caught the first man in the leg, sending him crashing to the ground. The other one didn't hesitate. He fired back, but I was already moving, closing the distance. I dove at him, knocking him off his feet, the 2 of us tumbling to the ground in a vicious struggle. He tried to bring the shotgun up again, but I was already there, my knee on his chest as I wrenched the weapon from his hands. He swung a fist at me, but I caught it, delivering a brutal punch to his face, knocking him unconscious. The fight was over in moments. They were done. But I wasn't done yet. I climbed back into the truck, heart still racing. Elena and the others had heard the commotion, but I didn't stop to explain. I gunned the engine and slammed the truck into gear, speeding out of the station and back onto the road. The night was far from over, but I wasn't running anymore. I had a target. Carlos Mendoza was still out there, and I was going to hunt him down, one piece at a time. The desert air felt thicker than usual, weighed down by the impending storm. The faintest hint of dawn was starting to creep over the horizon, painting the barren landscape in hues of gray and orange. But I didn't have time to appreciate the view. I was still in the middle of a war, and the day had only just begun. The road was long, but the truck carried me through it like a loyal companion. It had been hours since the skirmish at the gas station, but the adrenaline still buzzed in my veins. I had killed 2 men, but it wasn't enough, not by a long shot. The cartel had far more resources than just a few truckers and hired muscle. And Carlos Mendoza, their leader, was still breathing. For now. I kept my focus on the road, but my mind wasn't on the terrain in front of me. I was already thinking 5 steps ahead, anticipating the next move, the next fight, the next ambush. Carlos Mendoza wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. I knew that better than anyone. The cartel had a reputation, and they weren't about to let one man, and an ex-SEAL at that, shatter their operation. I checked the rearview mirror for the 100th time. The same empty desert stretched behind me, endless and barren, but my instincts told me that wouldn't last for long. They were tracking me. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The stalkers weren't far behind. I glanced at the survivors in the back of the truck. Elena had her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes flickering with a mix of exhaustion and fear. The others were just as silent, no doubt lost in their own thoughts, trying to process what they had just been through. I wasn't sure if they understood what was happening. They were in shock. This wasn't the life they knew, and they had barely begun to understand how far this thing went. I couldn't explain it to them, not yet. They weren't ready to hear the whole truth. The truth about Mendoza, about how deeply the cartel had spread across the border, infiltrating government, law enforcement, and everything in between. But I wasn't just going to kill a few men. I was about to take down an empire. The power behind the cartel's grip on this region, the network of corruption that kept it alive, was going to burn, and I was going to light the match. I took the truck deeper into the desert, toward a place I had been dreading, a small town near the border, a place that had always been a hotspot for cartel activity. They had eyes on every street, and I had no doubt that Carlos Mendoza had his people here, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The town was crawling with cartel sympathizers, and they would be expecting me, even though they didn't know it yet. The truck slowed as I neared the outskirts of the town. The sun was fully up now, and the heat began to settle in, the desert air heavy with dust. I could see the main street ahead, the crumbling buildings on either side. A few stray dogs wandered across the road, and a couple of locals stood by the store, seemingly uninterested in the world around them. The place had the feeling of a town that had been left to rot, its soul drained away by the cartel's grip. It was a town that had learned how to survive by keeping its head down. I stopped the truck a few miles outside the main strip and cut the engine. I needed to make my approach carefully. No more loud explosions or gunfire. This wasn't about making a scene. This was about finding Carlos Mendoza and wiping him out before he could send his men after me again. I grabbed my pack, checking it for extra ammunition and supplies. The sun beat down on me, but the weight of what I was about to do felt heavier than the desert heat. The others, Elena and the survivors, would stay in the truck. I couldn't risk dragging them into this, not unless absolutely necessary. They had already been through enough. The town wasn't far from here, just a few miles down the road. I could feel the tension building inside me as I adjusted the strap on my rifle, pulling the rifle close to my chest. My mind flickered through the past, the days when I had been in combat, when I had been sent to take out enemies with nothing more than my training and instincts. And now, here I was again, on a mission that felt just as personal as any I had ever been on. I moved quickly but quietly toward the town, keeping to the shadows, using the terrain to my advantage. The wind picked up, and I could hear the faint whistle of it across the desert floor. Every step I took, I thought of the men I had killed, the lives I had saved. But all that was in the past now. Carlos Mendoza and his cartel were my target. I wouldn't stop until they were finished. I made my way around the edge of the town, staying out of sight. I knew there were eyes on me, watching from windows and rooftops. Mendoza's men would be close, their informants scattered throughout the streets. I couldn't afford to make a single mistake. I needed to find the man who was responsible for all this chaos, the man who had orchestrated everything. The narrow streets of the town twisted and turned, and I kept my movements slow, deliberate. I had no allies here, not that I expected any. The town was owned by the cartel, from the drug dealers to the corrupt police officers who turned a blind eye to the violence. But I wasn't here to make friends. I was here to end this. I reached the center of the town, moving through the back alleys, keeping my back to the wall. I could hear the voices of cartel members ahead, their conversation low and clipped. I crouched behind a stack of old crates, waiting for the right moment. I knew this would be the most dangerous part of the mission, Carlos Mendoza's men were trained to recognize threats, trained to deal with agents like me, but they didn't know I was already there. They didn't know I had already set the pieces in motion. I had the advantage. A group of men appeared at the far end of the alley, armed to the teeth, their faces hidden by masks. I could see the weapons slung across their bodies, the way they moved with purpose. They were cartel enforcers, and I knew Carlos was close. I waited until they were halfway down the alley, then I struck. A burst of gunfire shattered the silence, and the men fell to the ground in an instant. It was over before they could even react. I moved quickly, stepping over the bodies of the cartel's men and making my way toward the building ahead. I knew where Carlos Mendoza was hiding. The final fight was coming, and it was about to be the last one. The air was thick with anticipation as I neared the building. The sounds of the town, the murmurs of distant voices, the clinking of metal seemed to fade into nothing, drowned out by the pounding of my own heart. I knew this was it. Carlos Mendoza was in there, the last man standing between me and the end of this nightmare, and I was going to take him down, no matter what it took. The narrow alley led to a rickety metal door, barely standing on its hinges. It was unguarded for now, but I knew better than to trust that it would stay that way. The cartel had eyes everywhere. I kept my back to the wall as I approached, moving swiftly but silently. The last thing I wanted was for the sound of my boots to alert anyone inside. I paused just before the door, my hand resting on the cold metal. For a moment, everything felt surreal. The last few days had been nothing but chaos. The ambush at the border, the firefight at the gas station, the chase across the desert. But now, standing here, everything was focused, clear. It was just me and the man I had come to kill. I took a deep breath, gathering the last of my focus before I pushed the door open. It creaked, barely a whisper, but it was enough. The darkness inside swallowed the light from the outside. I could see the faint outline of a few crates stacked in the corner and the outline of a desk, but there was no sign of anyone. I moved inside, my rifle at the ready, every muscle taut, every sense heightened. The building smelled like oil, old wood, and dust. Abandoned, but clearly used for something illegal. The place was quiet, too quiet. There was no sound of voices, no sign of movement. But I knew they were here. Carlos Mendoza wasn't just going to wait for me to walk in and kill him. He would be ready. I moved deeper into the building, each step deliberate, slow. I checked every corner, scanning every shadow. The place was littered with signs of the cartel's operations. Boxes of contraband, smuggled goods, bags of money piled in the corner. It made my stomach turn. This was where lives were ruined, where people were traded, where violence thrived. I had to finish it. The softest creak echoed from the other side of the room, and before I could react, I saw a figure move through the darkness, fast, too fast. I spun around, raising my rifle, but before I could fire, a voice cut through the air, low, dangerous, and calm. "Do you really think you can kill me?" It was Carlos. I could see the outline of him now, standing in the shadow of a doorway, his form tall and imposing. He had been waiting for me, like I had been waiting for him. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My finger tightened on the trigger, but he was already moving, stepping toward me, his hand rising. The world slowed. Everything in me screamed to pull the trigger, but in that split second, I hesitated, just a fraction of a second, long enough for him to dodge. He reached inside his jacket, and in the same movement, a gun appeared in his hand, pointed directly at me. I didn't think, I acted. I dove to the side, rolling behind a stack of crates. His shot rang out, missing by inches. The bullet lodged into the wall behind me, the force of it shaking the room. I didn't stop. I couldn't afford to. I pulled myself up, aiming my rifle toward where I thought he'd be. But he wasn't there. He was moving, faster than I had expected, always staying just out of sight, keeping himself hidden. Carlos Mendoza wasn't just a cartel boss. He was a fighter, trained to survive, to take down his enemies. And now, he was making me earn this victory. I ducked low, using the crates as cover as I tried to get a read on his movements. The silence that followed the gunfire felt oppressive, but I knew he was just waiting, just biding his time for me to make a mistake. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, soft but growing closer. He was circling me, trying to outflank me. I gritted my teeth, thinking about how many times I had been in situations like this, how many times I had faced impossible odds. This wasn't just about survival, it was about ending this. For good. I took a deep breath and moved. I didn't wait for him to find me. I came out of cover, moving low, fast, aiming for the spot where I had heard his footsteps. I didn't need to see him, I just needed to be in position. Just as I turned the corner, I saw him. Carlos Mendoza's eyes widened in surprise, but it was too late. I was already on him. I raised my rifle and fired. The shot was dead on, hitting him square in the chest. The force of the bullet knocked him back, sending him crashing into a pile of boxes. He didn't move. I didn't lower the rifle. I waited, watching for any sign of life. But it was over. Carlos Mendoza, the leader of the cartel, was dead. His reign of terror had ended. I stood there, panting, the weight of the moment hitting me all at once. The battle was over. The man responsible for so much pain, so much suffering, was gone. But there was no celebration, no sense of relief. I had taken him down, but the war wasn't won yet. The cartel had hundreds more like him, and somewhere out there, more guns were waiting to fire. But for now, the town was silent. The world felt quieter. The people who had been caught in Mendoza's grip, the victims, the survivors, now had a chance to rebuild, to live. And that, in itself, was a victory. I turned and walked out of the building, my boots heavy on the cracked concrete. I didn't look back. The sun had finally risen over the horizon, and the desert, though still vast and empty, felt just a little bit less threatening. The sun had barely risen when I stepped outside the crumbling building, the weight of the night's event still hanging heavy on my shoulders. The desert stretched endlessly before me, a vast expanse of nothingness that seemed to reflect the emptiness I felt inside. I didn't look back at the building. I didn't need to. Carlos Mendoza was dead, and with him, the beating heart of the cartel's operation in this part of the world had been ripped out. But the road ahead wasn't going to be any easier. There were still shadows out there. More men, more power structures that had supported the cartel's dominance. It wasn't over. Not yet. I had learned long ago that a single victory, no matter how decisive, only bought you a little time. I knew the cartel wouldn't just fade away. They had deep roots, too many allies in high places. And as much as I wanted to believe that taking down Mendoza was the end of it, I knew it was just a chapter in a much longer story. I reached the truck where Elena and the survivors had waited. They had no idea what had just happened, how the fight had escalated, how I'd taken down one of the most dangerous men in Mexico. I could feel their eyes on me as I climbed back into the cab, the air thick with questions. But no words came. Not yet. I started the engine, the truck rumbling to life, the sound breaking the silence between us. I kept my eyes on the road, knowing that every mile I put between myself and Mendoza's death was a step further from the danger, but also a step closer to the truth. Elena shifted uncomfortably in the seat beside me, her gaze never leaving me. I could feel her eyes burning into the side of my face. I had given her a lot of answers already, and I could tell she was still waiting for me to give her one more. But I wasn't ready to talk, not yet. The road stretched out in front of us, winding through the endless desert, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was leading somewhere I didn't want to go. It wasn't just the cartel I had to worry about. There were still too many things I didn't know, too many things I wasn't sure I could fix. I had always known this world was dirty, but it wasn't until now that I truly understood the depth of it. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. Nothing. No sign of pursuit, no cartel trucks, no helicopters overhead. The night had given me a brief reprieve, but I knew it wouldn't last. The cartel's reach was long, and they would send anyone to finish what I had started. I could feel it in my bones. The next fight was already coming. We passed the small town as I kept my foot on the gas, but there was no stopping. I couldn't afford to stop. The radio crackled to life, cutting through the quiet hum of the truck's engine. Elena's voice broke through the static, quieter this time, unsure. "Luke, you're not gonna stop, are you?" I didn't answer immediately. The weight of her words hung in the air between us. She knew that this was bigger than all of us, that this wasn't just a moment of violence, it was a mission. A war. I looked at her, just for a second, the road pulling me forward, my hands tight on the wheel. "No," I said, my voice low, firm. "I can't stop." We passed a few scattered buildings, and I felt the pull of the desert in my chest, like it was trying to swallow me whole. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The mission wasn't over yet. The cartel wouldn't stop unless they knew their entire operation had been torn down, piece by piece. But even as I thought that, another darker realization set in. The deeper I went into this, the harder it became to separate myself from it. Every fight, every person I killed, it started to bleed together. The adrenaline was wearing off, and I felt the quiet weight of what I had become. Elena leaned back in the seat, her eyes cast out the window, lost in thought. I knew she wasn't looking at the landscape. She was looking inside herself, piecing together the truth of what we had just gone through, what we had survived. And I could tell, just from the way her eyes flickered, that she was starting to understand the price of all this. The next town was another small, sun-baked patch of nothing. We stopped only for fuel, but as I pulled the truck into the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as soon as I set the brake. The desert had a way of making you feel exposed. I stepped out of the truck, surveying the area. The station looked deserted, but there were too many signs that suggested something was off. Footprints in the sand that hadn't been there earlier. The door to the station itself was ajar, and the faintest hint of movement caught my eye. Someone was watching. I moved quickly, scanning the area as I approached the fuel pumps. Elena followed closely behind me, but I could see the concern in her eyes. She wasn't stupid. She could sense it too. The game had changed. I reached for my gun, making sure it was secure at my side. But as I approached the station, I caught sight of something that froze me in place. A man standing just inside the door. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat, his face shadowed, but I recognized him immediately. The posture, the calm in his movements, it was familiar. It was something I had seen before, somewhere deep in my past. El Diablo, I muttered under my breath. The man slowly raised his hand, as though acknowledging the truth of the words I'd just spoken. Carlos Mendoza's second in command, a ghost I thought I had already buried. The moment stretched between us, and in that moment, the ground beneath me seemed to crack open, the weight of everything I had done crashing down on me. El Diablo smiled, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you, Agent Rivera?" My finger tightened on the trigger, but I didn't fire. Not yet. The desert wind howled through the open doorway, stirring the dust at my feet. The gas station sat in eerie stillness, the rusted-out pumps groaning in the wind. But none of that mattered now. Not the silence, not the heat, not even the truck idling behind me. El Diablo was alive. I had thought that taking down Carlos Mendoza was the final move. That with him gone, the cartel's operations in this part of the border would fall apart. I should have known better. Mendoza was never the real power behind the cartel. He was just the face, the butcher the world knew. But the one who really pulled the strings? He was standing in front of me now, calm, collected, and smiling like he had already won. "You didn't think it was over, did you?" His voice was smooth, dripping with amusement. He stood in the shadows of the station's doorway, just far enough inside that I couldn't get a clean shot. Smart. He always was. I had faced a lot of killers in my life. Cartel enforcers, corrupt officials, men who thought they owned the world because they had guns and money. But El Diablo was different. He wasn't just a killer. He was a tactician. A man who watched from the shadows, who let others take the fall while he built an empire that never stopped moving. I tightened my grip on my rifle, my breath slow and steady. "You should have stayed dead." He chuckled, stepping forward into the sunlight, his hands raised just enough to show he wasn't armed, not visibly anyway. And miss all the fun? I knew Mendoza was weak. The second I heard you put him down, I knew it was time to step out of the shadows. Behind me, I heard Elena shift uneasily, but she didn't speak. I didn't blame her. This wasn't her fight. Not yet. El Diablo cocked his head slightly like he was studying me. "You think you're winning, Rivera? You think you've hurt the cartel?" He exhaled sharply, almost laughing. "You haven't done a damn thing." I didn't respond. I needed to know where this was going. He wasn't here to fight, not yet. He was here to talk, to play the game. That meant he had something to say, something he wanted me to hear. He took another step forward, slowly, deliberately. "You're a smart man, a dangerous man. That's why I didn't kill you when I had the chance." I let the words settle in the air between us. when I had the chance. So he'd been watching. The whole time. My stomach twisted, but I kept my expression unreadable. "And now you're here to finish the job?" El Diablo smiled. "Not quite. See, you've already done half the work for me. You got rid of Mendoza. You wiped out his men. You've made it so much easier for me to take control. I should be thanking you." I kept my stance firm, my rifle still raised. "So that's what this is? A courtesy call?" His smile didn't falter. "I'm giving you a choice, Rivera." I waited, my jaw tight. "You walk away," he said, his voice low and smooth. "You take the girl, take the truck, take whatever heroic little story you're telling yourself, and you disappear. Forget about the cartel. Forget about me. You've done enough damage. But if you keep coming after us, if you keep thinking you can burn us to the ground," he shook his head, a flicker of something darker passing behind his eyes. "I will burn everything you love until there is nothing left." The words cut through the desert heat like a knife. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I had heard threats before, but this was different. This wasn't the reckless boasting of some cartel thug. This was a declaration, a promise. He meant it. I could feel Elena watching me, waiting for my response. But I didn't need to think about it. I already knew. I had spent my whole life fighting men like him. And I wasn't about to stop now. I raised my rifle just a fraction, the barrel pointed at his chest. "You talk too much," I said. For the first time, his smile faded. Just for a second. Then, with a slow, knowing nod, he took a step back, disappearing into the shadows of the gas station. "I'll be seeing you soon, Rivera," he murmured, and then he was gone. I didn't move for a long moment. I kept my rifle raised, my pulse hammering in my ears. But there were no more footsteps, no sound of a gun being drawn, no attack. He had let me walk away. For now. I turned sharply, heading back to the truck. Elena was already inside, gripping the dashboard like she was expecting the whole world to explode at any second. The others in the back seat were silent, their faces pale. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "Who was that?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "That," I said finally, "was the real problem." I put the truck into gear and peeled out of the gas station, kicking up dust as I hit the road. Everything had changed. Carlos Mendoza was dead, but I had just met the man who had really been in control all along. El Diablo wasn't just another cartel boss. He was the cartel. And now, he was coming for me. The desert stretched ahead, endless and quiet. But I knew peace wouldn't last. The fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. And I was ready. The truck roared down the highway, tires biting into the cracked asphalt, the desert stretching out on either side like an endless void. The heat shimmered off the road, blurring the horizon. But my mind was sharper than it had ever been. My hands clenched the wheel, knuckles white, muscles tight. The encounter with El Diablo wasn't sitting right. Not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't do. He had let me walk away. Men like him didn't just let people live, especially not when they had disrupted the balance of an entire cartel operation. He had looked me in the eye, made his little speech, and then vanished back into the darkness. That meant he had a plan. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Elena was staring out the window, her body tense, her face unreadable. The others in the back were silent, but I could feel their unease. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. Neither did I. But I was going to find out. The highway led toward a border checkpoint, one of the smaller, less traveled crossings into the U.S. It was controlled by a mix of federal agents and local law enforcement, but I knew better than to trust that meant safety. The cartel had its hands in everything. The moment I showed up, word would spread. If El Diablo hadn't already put a bounty on my head, he would soon. But there was no other choice. I needed to get Elena and the others out. I couldn't afford to have civilians in the crossfire. Elena shifted in her seat, finally breaking the silence. "Where are we going?" I kept my eyes on the road, scanning the horizon. "Somewhere safe." She scoffed, shaking her head. "Safe doesn't exist anymore." I didn't argue. She turned in her seat, looking at me fully now. "That man back there, El Diablo, you know him." It wasn't a question. I exhaled slowly. "He was never supposed to be part of this." She frowned. But he is? I nodded. And now, we have a problem. The highway signs ahead indicated we were 20 miles from the checkpoint, not far now. But as the road twisted through a narrow canyon, my gut clenched. Something was wrong. The stillness in the air, the way the rocks seemed too still, too perfect. An ambush. I eased my foot off the gas, slowing the truck slightly. If I was right, slamming into an ambush at full speed would get us killed. Elena noticed the shift. What is it? I didn't answer. My eyes flicked across the canyon walls, searching for movement. My heart pounded. The truck rumbled forward, dust curling from the tires, the tension thick as a knife's edge. Then, like a whisper in the wind, I saw it. A glint of metal, a shape shifting in the shadows. Rifles. The world slowed. Hold on, I growled, and then I stomped on the gas. The truck lurched forward, engine roaring as gunfire erupted from the canyon walls. Bullets ripped into the windshield, shattering the glass, slicing through the cab as I gritted my teeth and fought for control. Elena screamed, ducking down, shielding herself. The others in the back shouted, scrambling for cover. The ambush was well planned. They had waited for us. The cartel was always fast. But this was El Diablo's work. I swerved hard, trying to keep control as another burst of gunfire tore through the tires, the truck jerking violently as the rubber shredded beneath us. I had seconds to act. The truck was losing speed, veering wildly, but I kept pushing forward. The cartel was closing in, their trucks coming around the bend, kicking up dust, trying to box me in. I couldn't let that happen. With one final jerk of the wheel, I slammed the truck toward the canyon's rock wall, using the momentum to grind it to a brutal stop. Metal screamed, tires burst, but we were still alive. I threw open the door, grabbed my rifle, and shouted, "Move!" Elena was already pulling the others out, helping them scramble to cover as the cartel's men poured out of their vehicles, weapons raised, shadows moving fast. The fight was coming, and there was no running this time. I ducked behind the truck, shouldering my rifle, eyes locked on the enemy. The first cartel soldier rounded the front of his SUV, his rifle coming up. I fired first. The bullet caught him in the throat, dropping him instantly. Another came up behind him, firing wildly. I rolled to the side, keeping low, returning fire. One shot, two. He was down. The canyon erupted with gunfire, echoing off the rock walls. They had at least 10 men, maybe more. I didn't have time to count. Elena and the others were pinned behind the truck. They had no weapons, no way to fight back. This was all on me. A grenade sailed through the air, landing near the truck's front tires. I had less than a second to react. Grabbing Elena, I yanked her toward the rocks, shouting for the others to follow. The explosion ripped through the truck, sending metal shrapnel flying, fire roaring into the sky. The heat scorched my skin, but I didn't stop moving. I kept pulling Elena forward, kept firing, kept fighting. But they just kept coming. I took down another cartel soldier, then another. But there were too many. I was running low on ammo. I needed an opening. Elena's voice cut through the chaos. "Luke, there, up the ridge." I followed her gaze and saw it, a narrow path leading up the canyon wall. If we could get up there, we could escape, but we'd have to run straight through enemy fire. Elena met my eyes, breathless but determined. "We have to move, now." I nodded, knowing she was right. I reloaded my rifle, taking a deep breath. This was it, the final stand. I turned to the others, voice sharp, commanding, "Stay low, move when I move, do not stop, no matter what happens." Elena gripped my arm. "We're not leaving you behind." I swallowed, nodding once. Then I stepped into the open. Bullets whizzed past me, slamming into rock and dirt as I laid down covering fire, giving Elena and the others a chance to run. I moved with them, my heart hammering as we sprinted for the path, death snapping at our heels. The cartel kept firing, their voices shouting in Spanish, their trucks revving, trying to cut us off. But they weren't fast enough. We hit the path, scrambling up the rocks, the dust choking the air, the sounds of war raging behind us. One of the cartel gunmen spotted us, aimed his rifle up. I swung my M4, fired a single shot. Direct hit. The man crumpled. We kept climbing, faster, harder. The top was in sight. And then, sirens. the distinct piercing wail of law enforcement. The cartel hesitated. Too late. I reached the ridge, turning back just in time to see the cartel's men scattering, their trucks kicking up dust as they retreated. The tide had turned, but this wasn't over. Not even close. As I stood there, rifle still in my hands, Elena at my side, the weight of everything settling in, I knew one thing for certain. El Diablo wasn't done with me, and I wasn't done with him. The wail of sirens faded into the distance as the dust settled over the canyon. The sun was higher now, casting long, stretched shadows across the jagged rock formations. My breath was still ragged, my body wired from the fight, but the moment of silence felt unnatural, like a false peace, a trick the desert was playing on us. I turned my eyes toward the highway below, where the cartel's trucks had vanished in a cloud of dirt and desperation. They had retreated for now, but it wasn't out of fear. It was strategy. El Diablo didn't run. He repositioned. He was playing the long game, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And I wasn't about to give him that chance. Elena leaned against a rock, pressing a shaking hand to her forehead, her breathing uneven. The other survivors huddled together nearby, their faces pale, their clothes covered in dust and sweat. They had been dragged into a war they never asked for. But now, there was no way out. Not until this ended. She looked up at me, her dark eyes narrowing. What now? There was only one answer. We end this, I said. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow. How? I turned my gaze back toward the road, toward the invisible path the cartel had taken. El Diablo thought he had control. He thought he was the one making the rules, but now I was about to change the game. I know where he's going, I said. Elena frowned. And you're just going to walk into his stronghold? I exhaled sharply. That was exactly what I was going to do. By the time we made it back to the truck, my hands were steady again. My mind cleared of everything except the mission ahead. The tires were shredded, the body torn up from the gunfight, but it would still move. I climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine, feeling the machine groan beneath me. It was barely holding together, just like me. Elena climbed in beside me, watching me carefully. Tell me where we're going. I gripped the wheel. Nogales! She inhaled sharply. That's suicide. No, I corrected. It's necessary. Nogales wasn't just another cartel hideout. It was their nerve center, a fortress carved out of corruption and violence, where El Diablo had built an empire from the ashes of those who had challenged him before. It was the last place anyone would willingly walk into alone. But I wasn't just anyone. Elena stared at me, searching for any sign that I might change my mind. When she found none, she swallowed hard and looked out the window. Then, we're really doing this. I pressed down on the gas, the truck lurching forward onto the open road. Yeah, we are. The drive to Nogales felt like a countdown. Every mile closer felt heavier, like I was walking deeper into my own grave. The sun was burning overhead by the time the city came into view. A maze of low buildings, hidden alleyways, and streets soaked in blood. Cartel strongholds disguised as bars, warehouses, and businesses that fronted their drug trade. I parked the truck in an alley a few blocks away from my target. The warehouse where El Diablo was stationed sat at the heart of the district, a place where only the most trusted members of the cartel could enter. I had been there once before, years ago, when I was still working the border, chasing ghosts that never left behind evidence. Back then, I had no idea who the real puppet master was, but I knew now. Elena reached for my arm as I checked my rifle. Luke, you can't walk in there alone. I met her eyes. That's exactly what I'm going to do. She shook her head, frustration flickering behind the exhaustion. You'll be dead before you even get inside. I adjusted my gear, tightening the strap of my holster, feeling the weight of the extra magazines against my side. They're expecting me to run, not walk straight in. Her grip on my arm tightened. Then let's stop pretending. This isn't about taking down the cartel anymore, is it? This is personal. I swallowed. She wasn't wrong. It had been personal from the moment El Diablo let me live back at that gas station. He had wanted me to feel the weight of what was coming. He wanted me to understand that no matter where I went, no matter what I did, he would always be there, waiting, watching, one step ahead. He wanted me to know that I couldn't win. That was where he made his mistake. I leaned in, my voice steady. I don't care how personal this is. I'm going to kill him. She studied my face, searching for something. Doubt, hesitation. But she didn't find it. Finally, she let go. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching against the gravel. The city hummed with life, but beneath it was something darker, meaner, something that could smell the blood in the air. I had walked into war zones before. This wasn't any different. I moved fast, weaving through the alleys, my rifle slung across my back, my mind running through every possible scenario. This had to end here. There was no running, no retreat, no backup coming to save me. I was alone. And then I saw it. The warehouse loomed ahead, squat and ugly, its walls stained with old bullet holes, its doors guarded by two men who didn't look like your average cartel enforcers. They were killers, trained and disciplined, El Diablo's personal guards. I took a breath and kept walking. One of them stepped forward, a hand resting on the pistol at his side. Alto, ¿a dónde crees que vas? I smiled. To see El Diablo. The man looked me up and down, something flickering in his expression. Recognition, fear. He knew who I was. They all did. I watched the hesitation creep into his stance. He didn't want to be the one to start this. Too bad. I moved before he could reach for his gun. 2 shots, one to the chest, one to the head. His partner barely had time to react before I closed the distance. I grabbed him by the collar, yanking him forward, slamming my knee into his gut before driving my knife into his throat. He gurgled, eyes wide with shock, before collapsing in a heap at my feet. 2 down, 1 more to go. The doors to the warehouse loomed in front of me. El Diablo was inside. I stepped over the bodies and pushed the doors open. It was time to finish this. The warehouse swallowed me in darkness, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder, oil, and old blood. The doors groaned as they shut behind me, leaving the city outside, leaving the world behind. It was just me and him now. El Diablo was inside. I could feel it. The weight of his presence, the way the space seemed to pulse with something unseen but undeniable. The silence was a trap. Everything in this building was a weapon. My boots barely made a sound as I moved forward, my rifle raised, my heartbeat steady. The air was dense, too still. There should have been noise. The murmurs of men, the shuffle of movement, the scrape of boots on concrete. But there was nothing. He was waiting. I passed through rows of steel crates stacked high with smuggled weapons, cash, drugs, everything the cartel had built, stored in this one place like a shrine to its own corruption. This was more than just a hideout. This was an empire, brick by bloody brick. And I was about to burn it to the ground. A voice cut through the silence, smooth as silk. Took you long enough. I turned sharply, scanning the shadows. The voice came from above, the second-floor catwalk that stretched across the warehouse like a spider's web. El Diablo stood there, unarmed, or at least pretending to be. He leaned against the railing, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. He was dressed too clean, too precise. A man who didn't need to get his hands dirty because others did it for him. He spread his arms in mock welcome. I figured you'd come for me eventually. I just didn't think you'd be so predictable about it. I didn't lower my weapon. Then you don't know me as well as you think. He smirked, his gold tooth catching the dim light. Oh, I know you, Rivera. I know exactly what kind of man you are. He took a slow step forward along the catwalk, watching me like a wolf studying a wounded deer. You're just like me, he continued, his voice low, conversational. A killer. A man who doesn't stop, no matter how many bodies he stacks up. A man who tells himself he's doing the right thing, when really... He trailed off, shaking his head. I kept my aim steady. You don't get to compare yourself to me. He laughed deep and slow. Don't I? We both know the truth. You're here because you want to kill me, sure. But deep down, you're here because you need to. Because men like us, we don't know how to walk away. I took a step forward. I don't walk away from unfinished business. His smirk widened. Exactly. And then the lights cut out. Total darkness swallowed the warehouse. The temperature seemed to drop, my senses thrown into overdrive. The echo of my own breathing was the only sound. Then, movement. I spun, rifle up, listening. The first shot came from the left, a silencer whispering death. I dropped low, rolling behind a crate as the bullet sliced through the air where my head had been. Not alone. He had men in here, waiting, The warehouse exploded into chaos. The muzzle flashes of hidden shooters briefly illuminated the darkness before vanishing into blackness. I counted 4 different positions. They were closing in. I didn't hesitate. I fired a burst toward the first muzzle flash, the body dropping before the darkness swallowed him whole. Another shot came from my right. I ducked behind a crate, shrapnel spraying across my arm as the bullet slammed into metal. No cover, no way out. A shadow moved near the far wall. I adjusted, aimed, squeezed the trigger. The bullet found its mark. Another man down. The others kept firing. I could hear them repositioning, moving fast. They thought they had me cornered. They didn't realize I was hunting them too. I ripped a flashbang from my belt, pulled the pin, and hurled it into the darkness. The explosion of light and sound shattered the silence. I moved fast, my vision blurred but my instincts sharper than ever. I hit the nearest enemy before he could recover, my knife driving into his throat in a single clean motion. 3 down, only 1 left. The last shooter fired blindly, his aim sloppy, panicked. I lunged, knocking the weapon from his hands, twisting him around and shoving the barrel of my pistol under his chin. The struggle lasted a second. That was all I gave him. I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed, leaving only silence, and then clapping. Slow, mocking. El Diablo stepped forward, fully visible now, standing at the edge of the catwalk. "Beautiful," he mused. "Really, watching you work is like watching a symphony." I raised my rifle. "Time for the encore." His smile didn't falter. "You think killing me changes anything?" He spread his arms again, gesturing to the warehouse, to everything around us. This doesn't stop. You kill me, and another takes my place. The cartel doesn't die. It grows." I took another step forward. "Not if I burn it all down." His eyes flickered just for a second. "You don't have the resources for that." I smiled now, just slightly. "I don't need resources." I reached into my vest, pulling free the detonator. His expression finally changed. "No," he said. I thumbed the switch. The first explosion ripped through the lower level, fire erupting from the stacks of cartel supplies, sending a wall of heat rolling through the building. El Diablo stumbled as the catwalk shook beneath him. His composure cracked just for a moment before he lunged for the staircase. I was already moving. I sprinted up the catwalk, the entire building collapsing into flames around us. El Diablo ran for the exit, his footfalls echoing over the roar of the fire. I tackled him just before he reached the door. We hit the ground hard, rolling, fists flying. He fought like a man who had never had to fight for survival before, but he was strong, desperate. He threw a punch that cracked against my jaw, but I took it, swinging back harder. My fist caught his ribs, then his face. He stumbled, breath heaving, blood dripping from his lip. He looked at me, something close to fear flickering in his eyes. "No," he muttered again, as if trying to will himself into believing this wasn't happening. I grabbed him by the collar, yanked him close, and whispered, "It's over." The final explosion tore through the ceiling, sending debris crashing down between us. I threw myself back just as the flames engulfed him. El Diablo screamed, his body vanishing into the inferno, his empire turning to ash. I staggered back, coughing against the smoke, my vision swimming. The heat was unbearable. But I made it. I stumbled out of the warehouse just as the roof collapsed behind me, fire roaring into the night sky. Elena was waiting by the truck, eyes wide, breath caught in her throat. I looked at her, my body broken, my mind barely holding on. "It's done," I said, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it. The flames burned long into the night, turning the warehouse into a funeral pyre for El Diablo and everything he had built. The heat radiated across the empty streets, sending waves of shimmering firelight flickering against the nearby buildings. Even from a distance, I could hear the metal frame groan, collapsing in on itself as the inferno consumed it all. I leaned against the truck, every muscle in my body aching, my knuckles raw, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, heavier than anything I'd ever felt before. It was over. The fight, the chase, the war, I had won. And yet, standing there in the glow of the burning cartel empire, I felt empty. Elena hadn't said a word since I climbed into the truck, her eyes fixed on the blaze in the distance. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself, the shadows from the fire casting long streaks of gold and orange across her face. I could feel the weight of her gaze, even when she wasn't looking at me. "You did it," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to nod. "Yeah." She turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "So why don't you look like a man who just won?" I ran a hand over my face, wiping away the sweat and the blood that had dried there. "Because it doesn't feel like a win." Her brows furrowed, but she didn't push. She just looked back at the fire, at the warehouse that had once been the beating heart of El Diablo's empire. The cartel was finished, at least this branch of it, but I knew better than to believe that meant the fight was over. Cartels didn't die with one man. They adapted. They regrew. I had cut off a limb, but the body still lived, and it would come back for me one day. I turned the key in the ignition, the truck coughing to life, the engine rumbling beneath me. "We need to move." Elena hesitated before nodding. She didn't ask where we were going. She already knew. We weren't going anywhere in particular. We were just getting away. The highway stretched before us, an endless ribbon of cracked pavement and empty road. The city faded into the distance behind us, swallowed by the desert, by the night. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The hum of the engine, the soft howl of the wind, the occasional crackle of the radio were the only sounds between us. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Elena finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" I kept my eyes on the road, my grip firm on the wheel. "You get to live your life." She scoffed, shaking her head. "And what about you?" I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I didn't know. I had spent so long chasing this war, hunting these men, living for the fight, that now that it was over, I didn't know who I was anymore. I wasn't a border agent anymore. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't a hero. I was just a man who had spent too much time in the dark. She must have sensed the weight of my thoughts because when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "You could come with us." I glanced at her. She swallowed, looking down at her hands. "I mean it. You don't have to keep running. You could just... stop. Stop." I turned my gaze back to the road, my chest tightening at the thought. I had never been the kind of man who stopped. I didn't know how. And deep down, I knew the truth. Even if I wanted to stop, the fight wasn't done with me. El Diablo might be gone, but there were still others. Others like him. Others who had helped him build that empire, who had profited from the blood and suffering of innocents. They wouldn't let this stand. One day, sooner or later, they would come looking for me. And when they did, I had to be ready. Elena sighed, as if she already knew what I was thinking. She leaned her head back against the seat, staring up at the night sky through the cracked windshield. "You can't keep doing this forever," she murmured. I didn't respond, because I wasn't sure she was right. The sun was rising when we finally pulled into a small, nameless town just over the border. The streets were quiet, the buildings old and worn, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions. I found a rundown motel at the edge of town, the neon vacancy sign flickering weakly against the pale morning light. I paid in cash, no names, no records. Inside, the room was small, cramped, but it was safe, and for now, that was enough. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumped, exhaustion weighing her down. I stood by the window, staring out at the empty streets, my mind still racing even as my body begged for rest. "You should sleep," she said. I nodded, but I didn't move. She hesitated, then stood, stepping closer. Her voice was quiet, careful. "Luke." I turned my head, meeting her gaze. "Whatever happens next, you don't have to do it alone." Her words settled deep, sinking into something I hadn't realized was hollow. I looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "We'll see." She exhaled, shaking her head with a small, knowing smile. "Yeah, we will." She turned, crawling onto the bed, pulling the blanket over her shoulders. Within minutes, she was asleep. I stayed by the window, watching the horizon, waiting. I didn't know for what, for the next fight, for the next enemy. Or maybe, for the first time in my life, for the quiet. And maybe, just maybe, I'd let it last. For now. The desert heat clung to the town, the morning sun creeping over the horizon with an eerie stillness. The world had changed overnight, but I wasn't naive enough to think it had stopped moving. Fire might have consumed El Diablo's empire, but something new would rise from the ashes. It always did. Power vacuums didn't last long, and men like him didn't build empires without someone waiting in the shadows to take the throne. I stood by the motel window, watching the street, watching the nothingness stretch out into the horizon. My hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I wasn't drinking it. I wasn't even sure why I was holding it. Maybe because it gave me something to do, something to focus on, while my mind ran through the possibilities. Elena was still asleep, curled up beneath the thin motel blanket, her breathing slow, steady. The others were in separate rooms, exhausted from the weight of everything we had just gone through. They were safe for now. But safety was an illusion. It always had been. A knock at the door snapped me out of my thoughts. I didn't move right away, just listened. The knock came again, 3 taps, measured, deliberate. I set the coffee down and reached for my pistol. Elena stirred, but didn't wake. Slowly I moved to the door, pressed my back against the wall, and cracked it open just enough to see outside. A man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a clean button-down shirt and jeans that didn't belong in a place like this. He wasn't local. He wasn't just passing through. His stance was too firm, too controlled, and the way his eyes locked onto mine through the crack in the door, he had come for me. I didn't open the door any further. "Who the hell are you?" The man exhaled slowly, like he had expected that response. "My name is Nathan Cordero." His voice was even, calm. "I work for people who are interested in what you did back in Nogales." I didn't respond. I just studied him, waiting for the angle. There was always an angle. His lips pressed together slightly, like he knew I wasn't going to make this easy. "They sent me to offer you a job." I almost laughed. "I don't do jobs." "You did one when you took out El Diablo." I stiffened, my grip tightening around the pistol at my side. He caught that, his eyes flicking down for just a second before meeting mine again. "That wasn't a job," I said. He gave a small, knowing nod. "You're right. That was personal." I wanted to shut the door in his face, but something about him felt different. He wasn't Cartel. He wasn't law enforcement either. He wasn't twitchy, wasn't nervous, didn't have the desperate look of someone trying to cash in on a favor. He was something else. "You should leave," I said finally. He didn't move. "You know better than anyone that the cartel doesn't die just because you burned one of their houses down." I didn't answer. He continued, his voice quieter now. "There's already someone moving in, someone worse." I hated the way that sentence hit me, like a stone sinking into a lake. I had told myself I was done, that I had won, that this war, at least this part of it, was over. But deep down, I had always known better. Nathan shifted his stance, finally sensing that I wasn't going to pull the trigger just yet. "Come outside, talk with me, 5 minutes." I hesitated. Then finally I stepped out, closing the door behind me. We stood in the quiet motel parking lot, the heat rising from the pavement, the weight of everything unspoken settling between us. I crossed my arms. "Talk." Nathan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's a man named Rafael Ortega. You probably haven't heard of him." He was wrong. I had. And the second he said the name, the war I had convinced myself was over reignited in my veins. Ortega wasn't just another cartel lieutenant. He wasn't a foot soldier or a replacement boss looking to take the throne. He was something worse. He was a ghost. No one knew exactly where he came from. He had no paper trail, no history that could be traced. But in the cartel world, his name was spoken in whispers because wherever he showed up, things didn't just change. They disappeared. Entire operations wiped out overnight. Entire towns falling silent. People vanishing without a trace. If he was here, if he was moving into El Diablo's territory, then I hadn't ended anything. I had only started something bigger. Nathan saw the recognition in my face. "Yeah, that's what I thought." I clenched my jaw. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only one who can stop him." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "Not my problem." Nathan frowned. "It will be. The second he finds out what you did, he'll come for you." I already knew that. I had known it the moment I pulled the trigger in that warehouse, the moment I watched the flames rise. I had known I was inviting something worse. Nathan took a step closer. "You don't have to do it alone." I stared at him. Who do you work for? His lips twitched slightly like I had just asked a question he couldn't fully answer. Let's just say we have a mutual interest in keeping Ortega out of power. It wasn't a real answer, but it told me what I needed to know. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't DEA. He was working for someone bigger, someone who saw Ortega as a threat to more than just the border. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly. I had spent so much of my life fighting these wars, and I had told myself I was finished. But I wasn't stupid enough to believe this was over. Ortega was coming, and I had two choices: run or start hunting before he found me first. Nathan watched me waiting. I met his gaze, my body tense, my mind already running through the next steps, the next fight, the next war. And then I sighed, nodding. Tell me everything you know. Nathan didn't waste time. The moment I told him to talk, he started laying it all out like he had been rehearsing this conversation for weeks. Maybe he had. Maybe he knew that, eventually, I'd be standing right here, in this exact moment, with no choice but to listen. Ortega isn't like the others, Nathan said, his voice steady, measured. He doesn't run the cartel the way Mendoza or El Diablo did. He doesn't care about territory, doesn't care about loyalty or tradition. He moves like a phantom, setting up operations that vanish before anyone even realizes they were there. No arrests, no bodies, just silence. I kept my arms crossed, my mind racing, piecing together everything I'd ever heard about Ortega. He was a myth in cartel circles, a story whispered between soldiers to keep them in line. The devil of the desert, they called him, because when he came, there was nothing left. I shifted my stance. If he's so careful, why the hell would he make a move on this territory now? Nathan met my gaze. Because of you. The words hit like a gut punch. I had burned down El Diablo's empire. That much was true. I had shattered the structure, killed the man at the top, left his operation in ruins. But I had been naive to think that meant the end of something. All I had done was create an opening, and Ortega was stepping into it. I exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over my face. Where is he? Nathan reached into his jacket, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, and handed it to me. I unfolded it, eyes scanning the hastily scrawled notes. Coordinates, supply routes, names of men I recognized, lieutenants from other cartel factions that had either been absorbed or wiped out entirely in recent weeks. He's consolidating, Nathan continued, taking out the small players before anyone notices what he's doing. And now, he's moving his entire operation into what used to be Mendoza's territory. He's already set up 3 hubs near the border, 1 in Mexico, 2 on our side. I looked up from the paper. Which one is he in? Nathan hesitated. We're not sure yet. I felt my jaw clench. Then what the hell are you good for? He smirked, unfazed by my hostility. I'm good for making sure you don't get killed before you finish what you started. I stared at him for a long moment. He had the confidence of someone who had seen real things, done real things. He wasn't just some handler, some government asset playing a game from the sidelines. You've been after him for a while, haven't you? I asked. Nathan's smirk faded. Longer than I care to admit. Why? A shadow passed over his face, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Something raw. He took something from me, he said, and that was all. I didn't push. I knew that look. It was the same one I saw in the mirror every morning. Nathan took a breath, pushing the moment away. We have a lead on one of his top enforcers. Name's Diego Ruiz. He operates out of a compound south of the border, about 30 miles from here. If Ortega is anywhere, Ruiz will know where. I pocketed the paper. Then that's where I start. Nathan shook his head. You can't just walk in there guns blazing. Ruiz is protected heavily. The place is crawling with armed men, and Ortega's got his own security detail running operations. You need a plan. I scoffed. I don't do plans. Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, I figured. He reached into his pocket and tossed me a key. Then at least take the right tools for the job. I caught it, frowning. What's this? Storage unit, he said. About 10 miles from here. Weapons, gear, things you'll need if you want to survive what's coming next. I weighed the key in my palm. And you're just giving this to me? Nathan shrugged. Let's just say I have an interest in making sure Ortega doesn't get what he wants. I nodded slowly. And what exactly does he want? Nathan's expression darkened. Everything? I glanced toward the motel room, where Elena and the others were still asleep, oblivious to the storm that was coming. I need to get them somewhere safe first. Nathan exhaled, nodding. I know a guy, safe house near Tucson. He doesn't ask questions, and he's got enough firepower to hold off an army if it comes to that. I studied him for a long moment. Why are you helping me? Nathan's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was low. Because if Ortega isn't stopped now, it won't just be the cartel's problem, it'll be everyone's. I thought about that as I pocketed the key. Thought about all the people who had already died, the ones who would still die if I didn't see this through. I had told myself I was done, but the war wasn't done with me. I turned toward the truck. I'll move them out in an hour. Nathan nodded. I'll be in touch. I didn't watch him leave. I was already moving, already thinking ahead. The hunt had begun, and this time, I wasn't stopping until Ortega was dead. The truck hummed beneath me, the road stretching endlessly into the horizon as the first hints of twilight bled across the sky. The desert had a way of swallowing time, turning hours into minutes, making the world feel like it was standing still, even when everything was moving fast. Too fast. Elena sat beside me, silent. The others were crammed in the back, exhausted. Their bodies slumped against the seats as the adrenaline finally wore off. They didn't ask where we were going. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe they just trusted that I wouldn't drive them straight into another war zone. They didn't know that war was the only thing waiting for me. The sun dipped lower, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The storage unit Nathan had given me the key for was just outside of a place called Red Rock, a dusty patch of nothing carved into the Arizona desert, a place forgotten by time, forgotten by people, which made it perfect for men like me. I pulled off the highway, gravel crunching beneath the tires as I maneuvered the truck behind an old, rusted-out gas station that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. A row of storage units stretched along the back, their metal doors reflecting the dying light of the day. I killed the engine and climbed out, my boots kicking up dust as I approached Unit A14. The key felt cold in my fingers, too small for the weight it carried. I slid it into the lock, twisted, and pulled the door open. The light inside flickered to life, buzzing faintly, illuminating a cache of weapons, gear, and enough ammunition to arm a small army. Nathan had been telling the truth. I stepped inside, taking inventory. Rifles, sidearms, grenades, tactical vests, ammunition crates stacked against the walls. This wasn't just a stash. This was preparation. Someone, maybe Nathan, maybe someone even higher up, had been stockpiling this for a fight they knew was coming. And now, that fight was mine. Elena hovered in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. Her voice was quiet, measured. You really think this is going to stop him? I didn't look at her. I lifted a custom-built M4, running my fingers along the rail before checking the magazine. No, I admitted, but it'll slow him down. She sighed, stepping inside. And then what? You take out Ortega, and what? Another one rises? You keep going until there's nothing left of you? I glanced at her. There was something in her voice, not anger, not frustration. Something else. I loaded a magazine into the rifle, the sound of the metal locking into place echoing off the walls. I don't have a choice, Elena. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. That's what you keep telling yourself. I turned to her fully. You think I want this? My voice was harder than I intended, sharper. You think I wake up every morning hoping I get to spend another day chasing ghosts through the desert, waiting for the next bullet with my name on it? She didn't flinch. She just stared at me, her dark eyes unwavering. Then stop. I shook my head, my jaw clenching. If I stop, more people die. Her lips pressed together, frustration flickering across her face. And if you don't stop, you die. I didn't answer, because she wasn't wrong. She stepped closer, her voice softer now. Luke, you don't have to do this alone. I swallowed, looking away because the truth was I wasn't sure how to do it any other way. The sound of an approaching engine cut through the silence. I reacted instantly, grabbing a Glock from the table and pressing myself against the side of the storage unit, peering through the crack in the door. A black SUV rumbled into the lot, its headlights off. Not cops, not locals, Cartel, or worse, Ortega's men. Elena was already moving, grabbing a pistol from the rack, her breath coming in shallow, controlled pulls. The others stayed in the truck, unmoving, probably too exhausted or too scared to react. The SUV rolled to a stop about 20 yards away. The doors didn't open right away. Whoever was inside wanted me to make the first move. I glanced at Elena. "Stay low." She nodded. I stepped out, gun in hand, the storage light casting long shadows across the lot. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, lean, dressed in a dark suit that didn't belong in a place like this. He wasn't cartel muscle. He wasn't some street-level enforcer. He was something worse. His hands were empty, but that didn't mean a damn thing. He took a step forward, his eyes locked onto mine. "Luke Rivera," he said, his voice smooth, calculated. "You're a hard man to find." I didn't lower my gun. I wasn't hiding. A small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "No, I suppose you weren't." I studied him, my mind already working through the angles. Who was he? Who sent him? He tilted his head slightly like he could read my thoughts. "Nathan Cordero told you about Ortega, didn't he?" I didn't answer. The man exhaled, almost amused. "Nathan has a habit of playing his own game. He tells you just enough to make you think you have control, but never the whole truth." I narrowed my eyes. "And you're here to do what? Enlighten me?" His smirk widened just slightly. "Something like that." I tightened my grip on the Glock, then start talking. He took another step forward, his expression unreadable. "Ortega isn't just taking over Mendoza's territory. He's expanding. Bigger than you realize. Bigger than anyone realizes." I felt the muscles in my shoulders tighten. "How big?" The man's smile faded. "Big enough that when he's done, the word cartel won't even be relevant anymore." Something cold settled in my chest. He wasn't talking about a drug empire. He was talking about a full-scale operation. Weapons, human trafficking, political leverage. Cartel power had always been regional, territorial. But if Ortega was planning to expand past that, if he was aiming for something larger, this was a different kind of war. A war that no one was prepared for. The man watched me, his dark eyes sharp. "He knows about you, Rivera. He knows what you did to El Diablo, and he knows you won't stop." I exhaled, shaking my head. "Let him come." The man smiled again. "Oh, he will, but he won't come for you first." A sinking feeling crawled through my stomach. The man's voice lowered. "He'll go after what you care about." Elena. The others. Nathan. I didn't realize I had stepped forward until the man lifted a single hand, like a silent warning. "I'm not your enemy, Rivera. I'm giving you a chance to stop this before it's too late." I glared at him. "And what exactly do you want in return?" His smirk returned. "Nothing, except for you to understand one thing." I waited. The wind whistled through the empty lot, the world holding its breath. Then, finally, he said it. "This isn't a fight you can win alone." And for the first time in a long time, I didn't know if he was wrong. The wind shifted, stirring dust across the lot as the man's words hung in the air between us. "This isn't a fight you can win alone." I had heard those words before, from people who didn't understand the way the world worked, people who thought the fight could be won at all, that there was some finish line, some moment when all the blood and bodies amounted to something final. But war didn't end. Not in the desert, not against men like Ortega. I exhaled, my grip on the gun tightening before I finally lowered it, just slightly. The man standing in front of me wasn't flinching, wasn't watching my trigger finger, wasn't acting like a man who expected to be shot. That meant he wasn't bluffing. He knew things. I needed to know them too. "You have 5 seconds to tell me who you really are," I said, my voice sharp, low, unwavering. The man smirked, his dark eyes glinting under the motel's flickering neon. "I already told you. Nathan didn't give you the whole truth." I didn't blink. "That's not an answer." His smirk faded just a fraction, and for the first time since he stepped out of the SUV, something behind his expression shifted. Not fear, not uncertainty, something calculated. "My name is Gabriel Valera," he said finally, watching me like he was measuring my reaction. "I used to work for Ortega." That got my attention. My body tensed. years of instinct screaming for me to raise the gun again. Ex-cartel. That was a sentence that usually ended with a shallow grave in the desert. Gabriel didn't react to my sudden stillness. He just tucked his hands into his pockets, watching me with the patience of a man who had already made peace with what came next. Elena was watching from behind me, standing just outside the motel door. I could feel her presence, the tension radiating off her like a storm waiting to break. "How do I know you're not still working for him?" I asked, my voice cold. Gabriel let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "If I was, you'd already be dead." I stared at him, waiting. He tilted his chin toward me. "Ortega doesn't do cleanup like El Diablo. He doesn't send hit squads in the middle of the night, doesn't leave messages carved into bodies in the desert. If Ortega wants you gone, you just disappear." I thought about that. It made sense. Ortega was different, not just another cartel kingpin, not just another warlord waiting to take over the scraps of what men like Mendoza and El Diablo left behind. He was building something bigger, something unstoppable. Gabriel shifted, glancing at Elena, then back at me. I left because I saw what was coming. I saw what he's planning, what he's willing to do to make it happen. And I know you think you're ready for him, but you're not. I frowned. What is he planning? Gabriel hesitated, and then, finally, he said it. "Ortega isn't just moving drugs, Rivera. He's moving people." The words hit like a fist to the gut. Not just drugs, not just guns, people. I had spent enough time in this war to know what that meant. Ortega wasn't just trafficking bodies across the border. He was trading them, selling them, turning them into commodities that never saw the light of day again. Elena inhaled sharply, and I saw her fists tighten at her sides. She understood. I clenched my jaw. "Where?" Gabriel's eyes darkened. "All over, but his main operation, the real operation, is running through a compound deep in Sonora." He exhaled, shaking his head. "You take him out, it won't just be a win for you. It'll be a win for everyone he's touched." A long silence stretched between us. I had spent my entire life fighting monsters, and every time I told myself that I had seen the worst of them. But Ortega was different. El Diablo had been a warlord. Ortega was a businessman, and that made him more dangerous. I glanced toward the others, still asleep in the truck, unaware of how much darker the road ahead had just become. Gabriel met my gaze, his voice quiet now. "You don't have to do this." But we both knew that wasn't true. I had to, because if I didn't, no one else would. I turned back toward the storage unit, grabbing the M4 and a fresh vest, loading magazines into a bag. The weight of the gear was familiar, the rhythm of preparing for war second nature by now. Elena stepped closer. "What's the plan?" I zipped up the vest, slinging the rifle over my shoulder. "We go to Sonora." Her breath hitched slightly, but she nodded. No hesitation. Gabriel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're insane." I looked at him. "You coming or not?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Yeah, I'm coming." I nodded. "Then let's move." The hunt for Ortega had begun, and this time, I wasn't stopping until he was dead. The night stretched wide and endless over the desert, the moon casting a pale glow over the cracked asphalt as we tore down the highway, heading south towards Sonora. The air inside the truck was thick with silence, the kind that only comes when people are preparing themselves for something they know they might not walk away from. Elena sat in the passenger seat, her fingers curled around the grip of a Glock she had taken from the storage unit. She wasn't looking at me, wasn't looking at anything, just staring out the window, lost in whatever thoughts were circling in her head. Gabriel was in the back, loading magazines, checking his gear with the precision of a man who had done this 100 times before. He was quiet, but his presence filled the space. He was all in now. The others, the people I had sworn to protect, to get out of this alive, were in the SUV behind us, following at a safe distance. I had given them a choice, stay and fight or run and live. Most of them chose the latter, but some had stayed, too stubborn or too scared to leave this war behind. I didn't know if I respected them or pitied them. The truck rumbled beneath my hands, the engine humming steady and low. The desert rolled past us, the shadows of mountains and jagged rock formations cutting through the landscape like scars. Ahead, the road stretched straight and unbroken, but I knew what was waiting on the other side: Sonora, and Ortega. Gabriel broke the silence first. You ever been down to his territory before? I kept my eyes on the road. Not like this. He nodded slowly, watching me in the mirror. It's worse than you think. I already knew that. Ortega wasn't just a cartel leader. He was a machine, a system. He wasn't just running drugs or smuggling people across the border. He was building an empire. I had seen the aftermath of his work before. Towns turned to graveyards, entire communities hollowed out by fear and disappearances. People didn't just die under Ortega. They vanished. Gabriel shifted in the back seat. There's an outpost before we hit the main compound. If we're lucky, we'll get intel before we go in blind. I knew better than to hope for luck. Luck didn't exist in places like this. Elena finally spoke, her voice quiet, distant. What happens after? I flicked my eyes toward her. After what? She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at me. After Ortega is dead. After all of this is over. What happens to you? I didn't answer right away, because I didn't know. I had spent so long chasing men like Ortega. My life had been built on the next mission, the next fight, the next body that needed to drop before things could be better. But this fight, this war, felt different. Maybe because I knew deep down that if I kept going like this, I wouldn't walk away from it. Gabriel was watching me in the mirror again. I could feel it. You don't think that far ahead, do you? He muttered. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. There's no point. He smirked, but there wasn't any humor in it. Yeah, that's what I used to think too. We drove in silence after that. Miles passed. The road blurred. The world outside felt like it was folding in on itself, drawing us deeper into the war we had all signed up for. And then, just ahead, a set of headlights. I tensed, slowing the truck. Gabriel straightened in the back, reaching for his rifle. Elena gripped her gun tighter. The vehicle coming toward us was moving slow. Too slow. A bad sign. I killed the headlights, letting the truck roll forward as quietly as possible. Gabriel leaned forward. They're waiting for us. I nodded, already knowing it. The SUV ahead stopped in the middle of the road, blocking our path. The engine idled, the glow of its lights casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement. For a long moment, nothing happened. And then, the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, his silhouette tall, broad. He was armed, but his rifle was slung over his back. A sign. He wasn't here to start a fight, not yet. Another man stepped out of the passenger side, then another. 4 men total. But there were more. I could feel them, watching from the darkness, waiting. Gabriel muttered a curse. Ortega's men? I exhaled through my nose, pushing open the door and stepping out. The moment my boots hit the pavement, I felt the shift. The world around me tightened, the air thick with something invisible but undeniable. A standoff. The man in the lead took a step forward, his face illuminated by the headlights. He was older, his skin weathered, his expression cold and unreadable. "Luke Rivera," he said, his voice rough. "I was told you'd be coming." I didn't react. I just let the silence stretch, let the tension suffocate the space between us. The man nodded toward the truck. "You've got people with you." I didn't respond. He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "Ortega wants to meet." Gabriel tensed behind me. Elena shifted slightly, her finger hovering near the trigger of her Glock. I frowned. "Why?" The man smirked. "He respects you." That almost made me laugh. Respect? Men like Ortega didn't respect anyone. I crossed my arms. "Then tell Ortega I don't do meetings." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Not an option. You drive to Sonora, you meet him face to face, or you don't leave this road." I glanced toward the SUV behind us. The others were still waiting, still unaware of just how close we were to dying right here. I weighed the options. Fight? Number? Too many of them. Too exposed. Run? Nowhere to go. Gabriel leaned in slightly, his voice just low enough for only me to hear. "It's a trap." I knew that. But I also knew something else. If Ortega wanted to meet, it meant he wasn't sure of me yet. It meant he needed something from me. And that was leverage. I looked back at the man. "Fine," I said. "Take me to him." Elena stiffened. "Luke!" I shook my head, silencing her. The man nodded, stepping back toward the SUV. "Follow us." I climbed back into the truck, my muscles tight, my breath slow and steady. Gabriel exhaled sharply. "This is a bad idea." I gripped the wheel. "It's the only one we've got." The SUV ahead of us started moving, leading us straight into the lion's den. The road stretched forward, and I knew, one way or another, this was the beginning of the end. The convoy cut through the desert night like a silent blade, headlights slicing through the darkness as we followed Ortega's men down a road that barely deserved the name. The dirt path stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by nothing but open wasteland and the occasional skeletal remains of long-dead Joshua trees. The air was thick with dust, kicked up by the SUVs ahead, and every mile deeper into Sonora felt like stepping further into my own grave. The atmosphere inside the truck was tense. Nobody spoke. Elena's knuckles were white around her Glock, her jaw tight, her breath controlled but heavy. Gabriel sat in the back, watching the road with a quiet intensity, his rifle held low but ready. He didn't like this. Neither did I. But there was no turning back. The trap had already been set. I just had to make sure I was the one who walked out of it. Up ahead, the lead SUV slowed, veering toward a massive steel gate that stretched across the entrance of a compound carved out of the desert itself. Towering concrete walls loomed high, topped with razor wire and floodlights that bathed the sand in an eerie glow. Beyond the barriers, I caught glimpses of watchtowers, armed patrols, and structures built to withstand war. This wasn't just a cartel stronghold. This was a fortress. I exhaled, keeping my hand steady on the wheel as the gate groaned open. The convoy rolled through, swallowed by the compound, and the moment we crossed the threshold, the steel doors slammed shut behind us. I tightened my grip on the wheel, caged. Ortega wanted us inside before he made his move. The SUVs parked near a main building, a long structure made of reinforced concrete, with tinted windows and a heavy set of doors that looked like they belonged in a prison. The second we stopped, the armed men around us started moving. I scanned the perimeter. Too many bodies. Too many rifles. This wasn't just protection, this was a display. Ortega wanted me to know just how outnumbered I was. Gabriel muttered, "Bad idea." I smirked. "You mentioned that already." One of the armed men tapped the hood of my truck, gesturing for me to step out. I didn't hesitate, no sudden moves. Elena followed, keeping close, her eyes scanning every angle like she expected a bullet to come flying any second. Gabriel stepped out last, shoulders squared, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. The man who had led us here motioned toward the entrance. "Inside." I didn't move right away. "I want my people safe," he smirked. "That's up to Ortega." I didn't like that answer, but I didn't argue, not yet. We followed him into the building, passing through heavy security doors and stepping into a dimly lit hall lined with more guards. The air smelled of sweat, gun oil, and something else. Something faintly metallic. Blood. The hallway opened into a large room, dominated by a long wooden table, empty except for a few glasses of whiskey and an ashtray filled with half-smoked cigars. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but the books were just for show. The real decoration was the mounted weapons, rifles, machetes, even an old, rusted executioner's axe. And at the far end of the table, sitting in a high-backed chair like a king on his throne, Ortega. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 40s, but his eyes told a different story, dark, cold. A man who had seen things, done things, and never lost a night of sleep over it. He was dressed in a crisp suit, no tie, his jacket unbuttoned just enough to reveal the pistol holstered at his side. He smiled when he saw me. "Luke Rivera," he said, his voice smooth, almost friendly. I was wondering when we'd finally meet. I didn't respond. I just stared at him, letting the silence do the talking. Ortega gestured to the seats across from him. "Sit." I didn't move. "I'll stand." His smile widened. "Of course. A man like you isn't used to taking orders." I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on me. "Let's skip the bullshit. Why am I here?" Ortega leaned back in his chair, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Because I respect you." I almost laughed. He chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't believe me. That's fine. But it's the truth. I've been watching you for a long time, Rivera. The way you took out Mendoza, the way you burned El Diablo's empire to the ground. That kind of talent, he tapped his fingers against the table, shouldn't go to waste. My stomach twisted. He wasn't here to kill me. He was here to recruit me. I kept my expression unreadable. Not interested, he sighed, shaking his head. That's the problem with men like you. You think this is a war you can win, that if you just take out the right people, everything will fall into place. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. But the truth is, Rivera, the war never ends. The only way to survive it is to be on the right side. I stared at him, letting the silence stretch between us. Then, slowly, I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. And what side is that? Ortega smiled. Mine. I didn't break eye contact. You're trafficking people. His smile didn't falter. I'm selling what people already want. I clenched my jaw. And you think I'd work for a man like you? He shrugged. I think you'll realize soon enough that you don't have a choice. The room was too quiet now. I could feel the weight of every armed man in the building watching me, waiting. This was it. I could take the deal, let him think he'd won, or I could start a fight I probably wouldn't walk away from. Ortega watched me closely, waiting for my response. I inhaled slowly, forcing my pulse to stay steady. Then I smirked, just enough to make him think he had me. I'll think about it, I said. Ortega's smile widened. Smart man. But what he didn't know, what he'd never see coming, was that I wasn't here to negotiate. I was here to kill him. Ortega's smile lingered for a second too long, as if he thought I was really considering his offer. Maybe he believed his own reputation was enough to make a man like me bend the knee. He was wrong. I had already decided. He wasn't leaving this room alive. The problem was, neither was I, unless I played this perfectly. I sat back slightly, forcing my body to relax, my posture loose but deliberate. No sudden moves, no tells. Elena was still standing at my side, silent, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the chair behind her. Gabriel was across the room, near the bookshelves, his hands at his sides, tension coiled tight in his frame. The air felt thick, like a match waiting to be struck. Ortega reached for his glass of whiskey, lifting it with slow, deliberate ease. You know, Rivera, he mused, I respect men who understand the game. You're one of the few who does. You don't fight for countries or honor. You fight because you were made for it. Men like us, he gestured lazily between us, we don't get to choose peace. I kept my expression unreadable. He was trying to plant a seed, trying to make me see him as an equal. He took a slow sip, then set the glass down with a quiet clink. That's why I want you with me. I exhaled, tilting my head slightly. What's stopping me from putting a bullet in your head right now? The men around him tensed, a subtle shift, hands tightening near pistols, boots shifting against the floor. They were ready to kill me if I so much as blinked wrong. Ortega just laughed. Because you're not stupid. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. And because you know, if you do, you and everyone you care about dies before you even hit the floor. I let the silence stretch. Then I smirked. That's a bold assumption. His smile flickered, just for a second. Is it? I leaned forward slightly, mirroring his posture, my voice lower now. Or is it a mistake? His eyes sharpened. The shift was subtle, but it was there. He wasn't used to being challenged. Good. I needed him off balance. Because every second he sat here, drinking his whiskey, talking, thinking he had control, was a second closer to him dying. I had no weapons in my hands, no clear shot, no easy way out, but I had a plan. Ortega took another sip, watching me over the rim of his glass. Tell me, Rivera, what is it you really want? I met his gaze, and for the first time, I let a fraction of the truth slip through. I want to watch you burn. The words hit the table like a gunshot. The room shifted. Ortega set his drink down, exhaling sharply through his nose, his smile gone now. The men around him stiffened, waiting for the order. I kept my hands loose, my breathing steady. Timing had to be perfect. You don't walk out of here alive if you make that mistake, Ortega warned, his voice losing its amusement. I gave him a slow nod. Maybe not. Then I flicked my eyes toward his whiskey glass. His gaze followed, instinctively. That was his mistake. and the second his attention wavered, I moved. I kicked the edge of the table hard, sending his whiskey glass tumbling and knocking the table into his chest. He cursed, stumbling back as I lunged, my hands grabbing for the pistol holstered at his waist. Gunfire erupted. Elena was already moving, diving for cover, her Glock spitting bullets at the guards. Gabriel had his rifle up, squeezing off rapid shots, bodies dropping as chaos exploded through the room. I wrenched the gun from Ortega's grip, slamming my elbow into his jaw before twisting the weapon upward. He fought like a man who had never had to, desperate, wild, unpracticed. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the trigger. The shot ripped through his stomach, sending him staggering back, crashing into the bookshelf behind him. Blood bloomed across his crisp white shirt, staining it deep crimson. His eyes widened, breath choking on itself. I stepped forward, the pistol steady in my grip. He slumped against the shelf, one hand pressing against the wound, his teeth clenched in a grimace. "You don't win." I exhaled through my nose. I don't need to win. I pressed the barrel to his forehead, and I fired. The back of his skull slammed against the wood as the bullet punched through, his body going limp, sliding down to the floor. Blood pooled beneath him, seeping into the cracks of the concrete. I turned, scanning the room. The fight wasn't over. The guards were still firing, the air thick with gunfire and smoke, the scent of cordite clinging to my skin. Gabriel had taken cover behind the overturned table, his rifle barking with each pull of the trigger. Elena was crouched behind a fallen guard, reloading, her jaw set, eyes sharp. "Move!" I barked. I grabbed a rifle off one of the bodies, snapping it to my shoulder and squeezing off rounds as we pushed toward the exit. The compound was coming alive, alarms blaring, more footsteps pounding toward us. We had seconds. Gabriel shouted over the gunfire. "Plan!" I pulled a grenade from the dead guard's vest, yanked the pin, and lobbed it into the hallway. "Run!" The explosion shook the walls, sending a shockwave through the building. Smoke billowed, screams filled the air. We pushed forward, sprinting through the haze, taking out anyone who got in our way. The corridors were a maze, the compound sprawling and vast, but I had memorized the exits the second we walked in. We burst into the open courtyard just as more vehicles screeched to a stop outside the gates. Reinforcements. I cursed, grabbing Elena's arm and dragging her toward the nearest truck. Gabriel was already ahead, gunning down the last few guards standing between us and escape. The compound was burning behind us. Gunfire, screams, the end of Ortega's empire. I threw the truck door open, shoving Elena inside, as Gabriel jumped into the back, rifle still raised. I slid into the driver's seat, my heart hammering, blood running hot as I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck roared forward, kicking up sand as we barreled toward the gates. More gunfire. Bullets slammed into the metal, shattering the back window. We were seconds away from getting out. Then, a massive explosion ripped through the compound behind us. The force sent a shockwave across the ground, shaking the truck as flames erupted into the night sky. Ortega's empire was crumbling. Gabriel coughed, grinning through the smoke. "I think we overstayed our welcome." I smirked, gripping the wheel. Ortega was dead, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. The road stretched before us like a black vein in the desert, endless and empty. The only sound, the roar of the truck's engine and the distant echoes of gunfire still ringing in my ears. The compound behind us was nothing but a growing inferno, flames licking at the sky, smoke curling into the night like the last breath of a dying beast. Ortega was dead, but we weren't safe yet. Not even close. The cartel wasn't built on the back of one man. Ortega was ahead of the snake, but the body was still moving. And once the men who had sworn their lives to him realized he was gone, they would come for us with everything they had. This war wasn't over. Elena sat in the passenger seat, her hand still gripping her pistol like she wasn't convinced we'd make it out of this alive. Her dark hair clung to her face, her breathing ragged, eyes sharp with adrenaline. She wasn't panicking. She had been in enough fights to know better than that. But I could tell what she was thinking. What now? Gabriel was in the back, crouched low, reloading his rifle with steady hands. He had taken a hit somewhere in the chaos, a graze along his shoulder that was bleeding into his shirt. But he hadn't said a word about it. He knew as well as I did. There wasn't time to stop. I checked the rearview mirror. The dust behind us was thick, swirling in the headlights of the cartel vehicles that had just roared through the compound's gates. 3 black SUVs, moving fast. Too fast. "They're coming," I muttered. Gabriel didn't even turn his head. "Of course they are." Elena twisted in her seat, eyes narrowing. "How many?" "3. She exhaled sharply, checking her magazine before slamming it back into place. "We need to lose them before we hit the main road." I nodded. If we made it to the highway, we had a chance. But if they boxed us in before that, we were done. The first burst of gunfire came from behind. Rounds cracked through the back windshield, shattering glass, peppering the dashboard with shards. Gabriel ducked lower, swearing under his breath. "They're not wasting time." Elena turned, bracing herself against the seat. "We need to return fire." "No," I said, gripping the wheel. "Not yet." I swerved hard, sending the truck veering off the main road and into the desert. The tires skidded, kicking up dust, the suspension groaning under the weight. The headlights bounced wildly as we hit uneven terrain, dry shrubs and rocks rattling against the undercarriage. The SUVs followed, their engines roaring. Elena held onto the dash. "This is your plan?" I tightened my jaw. "Working on it?" Gabriel grinned, despite the blood on his shoulder. "I like it, messy, dangerous." He adjusted his grip on the rifle. "My kind of plan." The first SUV was gaining. I could see the driver's face now, a shadowed figure behind the tinted windshield. He was pushing the engine to its limits. The second vehicle wasn't far behind, the third lagging slightly as it maneuvered around the terrain. I needed to level the playing field. I reached down, pulling a flashbang from the center console and tossing it to Gabriel. "Make it count," I said. He caught it, laughing. "Oh, I will." He rolled down the back window, wind screaming into the cabin, then yanked the pin and hurled the grenade. The explosion of white light and sound filled the night. The lead SUV jerked violently, the driver swerving blind, tires losing traction on the loose dirt. The vehicle slammed into a rocky outcrop, the impact sending it flipping end over end, rolling across the desert like a toy kicked by an angry child. The second SUV tried to dodge the wreckage, but it clipped the back end, spinning out of control before slamming into a dry ravine. I didn't waste time celebrating. There was still one left. The third vehicle didn't slow down. If anything, it was going faster now. They weren't just chasing us anymore. They were ramming us. "Elena!" I shouted. She didn't hesitate. She twisted, leaned out the window, and opened fire. Her rounds punched through the windshield, shattering glass, the impact forcing the SUV to swerve, but the driver didn't stop. I saw it then. The driver wasn't slowing down. He wasn't planning to shoot us. He was planning to hit us, head on. "Hold on!" I shouted. I yanked the wheel to the right, jerking us toward a narrow rock formation. The truck barely squeezed through, tires kicking up a storm of sand. The SUV didn't make it. It clipped the rock at full speed. The impact sent it spinning like a broken top, metal screeching, sparks flying. The force was too much. The vehicle flipped, rolling violently before finally slamming into a boulder, where it came to a dead stop. The silence that followed was deafening. I kept driving for another mile before finally easing off the gas, letting the truck roll to a stop behind a cluster of rocks, hidden. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Elena exhaled first, resting her head against the seat. "That was close." Gabriel laughed, breathless. "That was insane." I didn't say anything. I just stared at the horizon, my fingers still clenched around the wheel. Ortega was dead. But the cartel had just sent a message. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The desert night wrapped around us like a suffocating shroud, the air thick with dust, sweat, and the iron tang of blood. The truck sat still behind the rocks, the engine still humming from the high-speed chase. But I could barely hear it over the pounding of my own heartbeat. Ortega was dead. The cartel should have been crippled, but they weren't running. They weren't breaking apart. They were coming. I had spent years hunting men like Ortega, but I had made a mistake. I had underestimated what his death would mean to the people beneath him. He wasn't just another boss to them. He was something more, a myth, a prophet, a man they followed not out of fear, but out of belief. And men who believe in something don't stop just because you cut off the head. Elena shifted beside me, her breathing still unsteady, her hands trembling as she checked her ammo. Gabriel sat in the back, his wounded shoulder pressed against the metal of the truck bed, his rifle across his lap. He wasn't saying anything, but I could see it in his eyes. We all knew what was coming. "They're regrouping," Gabriel finally said, his voice tight. "That wasn't their full force." Elena let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "We need to get the hell out of here." I stared at the road ahead, the vast openness of the desert stretching beyond us. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to run where they wouldn't find us eventually. "They'll chase us," I muttered. "Doesn't matter where we go. They won't stop." Elena clenched her jaw, looking over at me. "Then what do we do, Luke?" I didn't answer right away. I just closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of every decision I had made pressing down on me. Then I turned to them. "We end this," I said. "Here, now." Gabriel chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "I was afraid you'd say that." Elena swallowed hard, her gaze flicking between me and the horizon. "We're outnumbered," I nodded. "I know." "They have more firepower." I nodded again. "I know." She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "And you still want to do this?" I looked her dead in the eye. "I'm tired of running." She stared at me for a long moment. Then finally, she gave a quiet, bitter laugh. "You're going to get us all killed, you know that?" I smirked. "Probably." Gabriel clapped his hands together, exhaling through his teeth. "All right, fine. Let's do something stupid." We got to work. The landscape around us wasn't much, just jagged rock formations, dry brush, and the wreckage of our enemies littering the ground. But it was enough. We rigged what we could: gasoline from the dead cartel vehicles, grenades wired to makeshift tripwires, rifles set up in positions that gave us sight lines where we needed them. Elena climbed to a perch on the rocks with her sniper rifle, her eyes scanning the horizon, watching for movement. Gabriel and I took positions near the wreckage of the cartel SUVs, using them as cover. And then we waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. The desert stretched on, silent except for the faint whisper of the wind. Then, finally, headlights. Distant at first, a faint glimmer on the horizon, growing closer, multiplying. More SUVs, at least 6. They weren't being subtle anymore. This was war. Gabriel exhaled sharply. "Well, this is it." Elena's voice crackled through the comms. "I've got eyes on them. They're coming in fast." I reached for the detonator in my vest pocket, my thumb hovering over the trigger. The lead SUV hit the first tripwire. Boom! The explosion ripped through the night, shattering the silence, sending the lead vehicle spiraling into the air before crashing back down in a fiery heap. The others swerved violently, tires skidding in the loose sand, and that was when we opened fire. Elena's first shot punched through the windshield of the second SUV, killing the driver instantly. The vehicle veered off course, smashing into a boulder. Gabriel and I unloaded rounds into the others, the crack of gunfire echoing across the desert. They returned fire, bullets whizzing past us, slamming into the truck, the rocks, the dirt. But I wasn't thinking about dying. I was thinking about finishing this. A cartel gunman charged toward us, rifle raised. I dropped him with a quick burst, then swung around to fire at another who was trying to flank. The battle turned brutal, fast. They kept coming, wave after wave, relentless. They weren't just here to kill us. They were here to make a statement. Gabriel took a hit, a round grazing his side, sending him staggering back with a grunt. But he kept firing, dropping another cartel soldier. I felt a round tear through my arm, the pain hot and sharp, but I gritted my teeth and kept moving. Elena's rifle cracked again, and another body hit the dirt, but there were still too many. I reached into my vest, pulling my last grenade. This was it. I armed it, waited for the right moment, then hurled it into the cluster of advancing men. The explosion lit up the night. Bodies were thrown into the air, flames swallowing what was left. The cartel soldiers who remained hesitated, just for a second. That was all I needed. I raised my rifle, took aim, and squeezed the trigger. One by one, the last of them fell. Then, finally, silence. I stood there, breathing hard, my body screaming in pain, my vision blurred by sweat and smoke. Gabriel let out a harsh, shaky laugh, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. Jesus Christ! Elena climbed down from her perch, her face unreadable as she took in the bodies, the wreckage, the burning remnants of the fight. And then, finally, she looked at me. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked out at the desert, at the destruction we had left in our wake, and for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't know. The night air was thick with smoke, the scent of blood and burning metal hanging in the desert like a ghost that refused to leave. The battlefield was still, bodies sprawled across the dirt, bullet casings glinting under the weak light of the moon. The fire from the wrecked Cartel SUVs crackled in the silence, casting flickering shadows across the carnage. I stood in the center of it all, my rifle hanging loose in my grip, my body screaming from wounds I didn't have the time to count. My breath came in sharp, uneven pulls, my lungs burning from the fight. My fingers ached from squeezing the trigger, my arm throbbing from the bullet that had torn through it. But I was still standing. Gabriel leaned against the wreckage of a flipped SUV, blood seeping through his side, his breathing heavy but steady. His rifle lay beside him, empty, the last of his ammo spent taking down the final Cartel soldiers. He looked at me with tired amusement, shaking his head. "You're one crazy son of a bitch, Rivera." I smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Took you this long to figure that out?" Elena approached, her boots crunching against the dirt, her sniper rifle slung over her shoulder. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes told me everything. She was relieved we were alive, but she wasn't celebrating. She knew the same thing I did. This wasn't a victory, it was survival. She stopped next to me, looking out at the destruction. "Is it over?" I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to believe that Ortega's death had ended this, that the last of his men had fallen in this battle, that we could walk away now. But I knew better. A cartel like his didn't just die in one night. It fractured, it broke apart, but it didn't vanish. Somewhere, right now, men were already making calls, planning, retaliating. This war would spill over, ripple out in ways I couldn't stop. But I had done what I came to do. Ortega was dead, and if nothing else, that meant something. Gabriel let out a slow breath, wincing as he shifted against the SUV. "We need to move before the wrong people come looking for us." He was right. Even if we had wiped out every cartel soldier that came for us, there were still other threats. Cops, corrupt federales, opportunists looking to take over Ortega's empire. If we stayed here, we'd be nothing but targets. I nodded. "Load up. We head north." Elena hesitated, her gaze lingering on me. I could tell she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she just turned, heading back to the truck. We moved quickly, stripping the dead for any supplies we could use. Ammunition, weapons, cash, anything that could help us make it out of Sonora alive. By the time we piled into the truck, the fires behind us had started to die, leaving behind nothing but blackened wreckage and bodies that no one would bury. I started the engine, the hum of it vibrating through my bones, and without another word, I pulled onto the road. For the first time in what felt like years, I drove away from a battlefield instead of toward one. We crossed the border before sunrise, taking back roads, avoiding checkpoints, slipping through the cracks in a system that had been built on bribery and blind eyes. By the time we hit Arizona, the world felt different, quieter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was waiting for a bullet that hadn't been fired yet. We stopped at a gas station outside of Tucson, the first real sign of civilization in miles. Gabriel stayed in the truck, pressing a bloodied rag to his side, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Elena leaned against the hood, arms crossed, watching the sky like she was waiting for it to fall. I stood near the payphone, staring at the numbers I had carved into my memory a long time ago, numbers I never thought I'd dial again. And then, before I could stop myself, I picked up the receiver and made the call. The line rang once, twice, then a voice. "You're alive." I closed my eyes. For now. A pause, then, "Is it done?" I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around the receiver. Ortega's dead. His men are scattered, but this isn't over. Another pause. "It never is." I swallowed the bitterness on my tongue. I need to disappear. The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "Where do you want to go?" I looked at Elena, at Gabriel, at the road stretching out beyond the gas station. Then I said, "Somewhere quiet." The voice didn't argue, didn't question, just said, you'll have it. But Rivera, once you go off the grid, you don't come back. I nodded to myself. I know. The line clicked dead. I hung up the phone, the weight of everything crashing down on me all at once. I was done. Done fighting, done running, done chasing ghosts in the desert. I walked back to the truck, looking at Elena and Gabriel. They were waiting for me to say something, to tell them what was next. So I did. We disappear. Elena's lips pressed together, but she nodded. Gabriel just let out a tired laugh. About damn time! I got behind the wheel, turned the key, and drove. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't driving toward a war. I was driving toward the end. The end.